Hey there students, James here from the Everlearner. Thank you for taking a look at this video. I really appreciate it. This is in fact, it's just over 4 hours of teaching content which is there to prepare you for your A-level physical education and the psychological components papers. Now, really important I stress this to you, this revision session is for all exam boards including AQA, OCR, Edexcel, WJEC. If it's not for your board, we will specify it in the session and you can miss that bit out, okay? If you want to jump to any particular piece of content, have a look in the links below. We've got all of the jump to links so you can go to one piece and miss out others. 4 hours is a lot, right? I mean, who wants to take 4 hours all in one go? Unless it's the night before the exam, hey? So, get stuck in, enjoy it, make sure you've got the notes pages. They're absolutely essential to this session. They're just down there. Click, print, get yourself ready. 4 hours, let's go.
So classification of skill can probably be thought of as some kind of gateway knowledge to a much wider base of skill acquisition, or kind of like the psychological process in sport kind of theory, right? So it's gateway theory. We're going to get questions on it in its individually, but it's also going to feature as part of our understanding of a broader concept. So if we think about information processing, if we think about memory, if we think about practice conditions, practice types, mental processes, selective attention, perception, all these sorts of processes are going to be founded in this gateway theory of classification of skills. So it's super important that we get this right, because it's going to be a foundation of so much else. So that being said, I'll make reference to that as we go, but most important, let's make sure that we fundamentally understand this process. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to introduce you to what we call the muscular involvement continuum. So make sure that you can use that term. Don't be too shocked if that term appears in an exam question for you. And if it does, you should be able to recognize that muscular involvement continuum refers to skills that are either gross or fine, or probably somewhere in between. So first things first, I want to talk about gross skills with you. So what is a gross skill? I'll look at all of our examples in just a moment's time, okay? So with gross skills, what are we talking about? Well, first of all, we're talking about large muscle movements, okay? So that should straight away give an indication of the types of sporting skills that would be described as gross, more of which in a second. We're also talking about predominantly large muscle groups. So think about muscles of the body, and particularly those of the legs, arms, and trunk. These are large muscle groups, the deltoid, the quadriceps, the hamstrings, the biceps, and so on and so on. These are large muscle groups. So when these are actively involved in large-scale movements, we are very likely to be talking about a gross skill. We're talking about skills which involve power. We're talking about skills which involve things like stamina. We're talking about skills which involve strength. Now, I'm pretty confident that if you can think of a stamina exercise, for example, it's probably, let's take endurance cycling, it's going to involve things like large muscle movements and large muscle groups, right? So therefore, we get this tie-in. And as I mentioned before, don't consider this last one to be a rule, okay? But it tends to involve movements of the legs, arms, and trunk, as opposed to things such as the fingers, for example. Okay, so these large muscle groups, they tend to be the legs, arms, and the trunk. Now, fine skills are really quite different. With fine skills, we're talking about a different notion. We're talking about skills which involve small muscle, I've left myself enough room here, movements. Small muscle movements. We're talking about skills which are based on accuracy, precision. One of the things I really like to say is about control, skills which involve control. Think about even adjusting something like a balance position, whether it's on a sprint start or in gymnastics or whatever. We're balancing out by using sort of small muscle groups to control that balance. It's also, I like to think about it, is how we produce direction, the accuracy of directing something. And finally, I should have said this right at the start, it tends to involve small muscle groups. Now, we could get into like the proprioceptive nature of small muscle groups as opposed to large muscle groups, and the availability of muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs that provide that proprioceptive feedback loop. But for now, let's just realize that if the movement involves small, intricate muscular contractions for accuracy, precision, control, and direction, we are talking about a fine skill. So let's take our performers and our performances, and let's see if we can draw these across and actually place them somewhere here on the continuum. So if we were to take the entire sport of netball, we'd probably find that it's kind of somewhere in between, okay? So here we'd have netball, Okay, somewhere in between. It's relatively gross, but there's fine elements. But if we took something like shooting in netball, okay, shooting in netball, it's going to be way up here, okay, towards the fine end. Let's take sprinting. Now, I reckon you guys can have a pretty good guess that sprinting is down here towards the gross end. Why? How could we justify that? Well, it's large muscle movements, large muscle groups. It involves power, strength, and it's a movement of the legs, arms, and trunk. So therefore, it's a gross movement. Let's take triathlon. This is a triathlete here. She's in blue, isn't she, Kate? Let me try and choose the right colour. So we've got Kate here. Okay, so we've got Kate, and obviously what we've got here is we've got something which is based on stamina, right? So again, our triathlon, I'm not meaning to make it anywhere particularly further away than sprinting, consider it to be roughly in the same place. Triathlon's going to be down here towards the gross end. Now this is a really interesting one, what we've got here with Laura. She is a rhythmic gymnast, okay? Now rhythmic gymnastics involves really powerful, forceful movements, but done with hyper control and hyper accuracy. So how do we justify that on this continuum? And in that sense, and in many cases in sport, this is where we find the most interesting factor. We might put it somewhere like here, if I just broadly call it gymnastics floor routine, we might put it somewhere like there, okay? But, of course, that's what's interesting about this performance. It's very, very powerful, very, very spectacular, but we expect the gymnast to be hyper-controlled. So you've got kind of this trade-off, this power-finesse trade-off that moves along this continuum, okay? Now, if Laura made her performance much more powerful, does that mean she would lose things like precision and control? Well, probably it does. If she made it more precise, more controlled, does it mean she would lose the spectacular nature of the powerful movements? Probably it does. So these things are really interesting. Finally, let me just bring down to Tom here. Sorry, Joe, I should say. So we've got Joe here, who's our tennis player. And tennis is an interesting one, again, somewhat similar to gymnastics. It can be powerful, but if we think about accuracy, precision, control, direction, it tends to have sort of like a slightly more fine element to it. But let's not forget that there's lots of aspect to it. Large muscle movements, large muscle groups. It can be powerful, a big hit, a smash, a first serve, those kind of things. You do have to demonstrate stamina, especially over a 5-set match, for example. So again, it might really be in this continuum that we actually need to break this down. So could we say, right, a first serve is down here, whereas something like a drop shot is up here. Okay, so maybe to really understand tennis well, we have to break it down into its elements. Now, final thing for me on this particular continuum, I'd just like you to think about practice types. Okay, so in terms of this gross stuff, of course, what you've got here is you've got movements which are powerful, strong, stamina-based. We tend to find that you can find sometimes that this needs to be practiced with what we'd call distributed practice. Okay, in other words, it's done in a way that you perform a series of repetitions, but then you have a break, a gap in the middle, because of that kind of Oops, didn't mean to do that. Because of that power element. Whereas something like a fine skill, certainly if it's a discrete skill, more of which in a second, we might find that this is practiced as massed practice. Okay, and what we mean by that is there's no breaks within the repetition. Let's take a practice shooting in netball, for example. We might just repeat without any breaks. Whereas these kind of more powerful strength-based exercises, we may need to build breaks into that, and that's where distributed practice becomes interesting. Okay, let's move on. We're now going to have a look at, let me put this in white here. We're now going to have a look at what we call the remember the N, environmental continuum. Environmental continuum. Okay, and here obviously we're looking at the notions of closed and open skills. So the first thing I'd like you guys to realize when we talk about the environmental influence, we're talking about the notion of the sporting display. Remember, the sporting display, the word display refers to all the information surrounding the performer and from within the performer as well, of course. So we're talking about the sporting display. Now, let's first of all talk about closed skills. Well, closed skills work like this. They are, got the wrong yellow again, they are stable. Okay, more of that in a second. They are consistent in the sense that they are performed in the same way over and over again. They are predictable. Okay, they are predictable. There's no kind of nuanced, surprising technique being developed. They are, a lovely word to use here, they are habitual. They are pre-learned. And they are self-paced, more of which in a few moments' time. Okay, so all those terms, first of all, can be used to describe a closed skill. But the first thing we want to realize about a closed skill is it takes place in an unchanging environment. Okay, an unchanging environment. Okay, an unchanging environment. In other words, the environment in which the skill is performed. Let's take a shot put technique as an example. It's completely stable, consistent, and therefore the way the skill is performed by the performer can become habitual. Absolutely the same each time, unless there's a deliberate attempt to change that technique. If we now compare that to something like open skills, we get a different case. We are talking about skills which are unstable. Okay, that means that they do change, the environment does change. We're talking about skills that involve what we like to describe as constant adjustment. Okay, so the skills are constantly adjusted to meet the context of the environment. They are what we'd call perceptual skills. Okay, perception, of course, is about interpretation of the environment. Now, we could go on about the DCR process here, but we'll leave that for another day. They are cognitive. Okay, so this is going to involve things like decision making, for example. Decision making. And finally, they are externally paced, which we're going to understand a little bit better in a few moments' time. Okay, they are externally paced. Generally, that's a tendency. Externally and self-paced in this context, they're not always that way, but generally speaking, they're externally and self-paced. Now, the way we really need to begin to understand this is by putting examples in. So let's first of all, I can't quite get it completely in, I don't think. So let's first of all look at our netball example. Let's take netball. Netball, generally speaking, occurs in an unstable, changing environment. So our netball performance is going to go somewhere up here. Okay. However, if we were to take something like a penalty shot at goal, that is completely stable and would be down towards the closed end. You know, if a goal shooter has gone to take a shot, they've been fouled, and then they take that penalty shot where the player stands next to them and they're unopposed. That is a completely closed skill. Okay, whereas netball in general is very changeable and unstable because the environment changes, the defensive the position of the defensive player, the position of the teammate you're looking to get the ball to, the arc of the centre around the D, for example, is always changeable and unpredictable. Even though there are set plays and rhythms to things, it is an open, unstable environment. Let's now take something like sprinting. Well, of course, it's closed. It's down here. Why? Because it's absolutely predictable. The only part of sprinting that we could say is open is the idea of the gun. Okay, it's an external stimulus, and it's a single external stimulus. So we still suggest this is a very closed skill. Let's take triathlon. Triathlon, very much the same. It's going to be down. Let me put down here. They're roughly in the same place. Triathlon is a closed skill. Now, the only things that become open in triathlon are where you're swimming in close proximity to another racer, where you're having to overtake or undertake another cyclist, for example, or you're going for a sprint finish because you're neck and neck with an opponent. These become more open concepts, but still the delivery of the skill is closed. Let's look at Laura and her floor routine. If I just put floor routine in here, again, it's closed. The environment is stable. It's not going to change. Okay, you could argue there's slightly more spring in one sprung floor to another one in different events, but generally speaking, the event is the same. Tennis is a really fascinating one. Tennis is relatively open, but if we were to look at something like a tennis serve, it would be closed because it's a stable environment, unless your opponent's really moving about down the other end, for example, or there's very strong wind. So tennis is really an open environment because where you strike the ball from and how you strike it is very much dictated on how the ball is hit back to you. So therefore, it's a changing, unstable, constant adjustment, perceptual skill. Now, for this reason, what we tend to find is that closed skills tend to get practiced in a fixed practiced environment, and our open skills tend to get practiced in what we call a varied environment, something which sort of replicates the unstable changing conditions of the open skill. A classic example is team games doing possession drills, where the possession drill incorporates defenders, teammates, passing, possession, this kind of thing would be a classic example of a varied practice to develop that open skill. Think in your mind, right, what is the value of taking something like, I don't know, taking something like tennis or choose table tennis or choose basketball or whatever. And let's identify all the individual skills and practice them in isolation. Let's practice the forehand drive. Let's practice the backhand backspin. Okay, if you practice that in a closed, fixed environment where the ball is always delivered to the same place, is that realistic for how that skill would be performed? You might do it a bit at the time to hone the skill, but ultimately you have to move it into a varied environment. Okay, enough. Let me make that slightly bigger, actually. I'm going to do that like that. Let's do it like that. Okay, so what are we going to do here? We've got a question. Select two. Select two of these 5 skills. Okay, so only 2 of them are going to get me marks. Place both on the continua provided and justify the placement of each. So let's have a look at this. I've got 2 continuum, open and closed, gross and fine. By the way, don't forget, these could be the other way round on any question. Gross could be up here and fine down here. Open up there, close down here. They're often presented the other way round, so just be prepared for that. Now, I've got a command here, which is to justify. Justify, by the way, is give reasons why. So the classic example is to say things like, this is because, the reason for this. Okay, that's the type of language we're going to use here. So first of all, let me see what I'm going to do. I'm going to choose my cyclist for the first example, and I'm going to choose passing in netball. I'm going to specifically say this is passing in netball, not just netball altogether. So let me justify cycling. Oh, sorry. Let me be clear. C, our cycling, is a closed skill we're going to put up there, whereas our netball passing is an open skill. I'm going to put it there. Let me justify it. Cycling is closed. What am I going to say here? Because I'm justifying. So I have to say why. Because there is little environmental interpretation. Nice term for us to use. There is little environmental interpretation. In other words, we could say here, it's a stable, consistent environment. And we're going to say here, passing in netball. I'm just going to say passing. You would write passing in netball probably. Passing, let me put it in. Passing in netball is open because the environment is continually changing. In fact, let me restate that the environment is, I'm going to use the word unstable. Okay, so let me use the word unstable. And of course, your examiner is going to come along there. They're probably going to mark your positioning as correct, but they're going to look here is little environmental interpretation. Environment is unstable. Okay, so we're looking for that key language within our answer. Let's move on. We've got exactly the same concepts here. We're now talking about gross and fine skills. And I'm going to choose this time, I'm going to choose sprinting, and I'm going to choose, let's see, I'm going to choose the tennis example, and I'm going to consider it to be a second serve. Okay, so I'm going to specify that in my answer. Okay, so let's have a little look at how we do that. So we're saying here sprinting, and I've got to justify again, remember, sprinting is gross. Next word, guess what it is? Because. Sprinting is gross because it involves large muscle groups. And I could give an example there. I could name the quadriceps, for example. Let's do that, such as the quads. Okay, so we're being specific. And then we've got this point here. Okay, passing in netball. Got to justify this, of course. Passing in netball. Oh, what am I doing? Passing in netball. What am I talking about? Guys, I'm so sorry. Let me delete that. I was thinking about my last answer. I'm sure you recognize that, right? Second serve in tennis. Is fine. Second serve in tennis is fine because, got a little bit lost there, didn't I? It must be precise. In other words, they've got to get it in. It must be precise. Okay? It must be precise, but still relies on power. Okay, I'm kind of sort of saying like it's not completely fine, but still relies on power. And of course, what have I not done in this particular answer? I've not actually put the items on the continuum. Okay, so here I'm going to get my placement correct and get my mark for my 3 there. It's going to get me my max in that first answer. I must place these on here. So I've got my sprinting, which is gross. My sprinting was letter A. And I must put my serve. I'm going to put it down here. Not completely fine because it does still involve power, but I've got my D there. My examiner is going to mark me correct for my placements. And my examiner is going to go, okay, large muscle groups, mark, and they're going to say it must be precise. And there's my max. Right, last question here before we finish, at least for this section. Explain why. Okay, when we explain why, again, we're saying because, we're saying this means, we're saying therefore, comma. We could be even saying things like this causes. So this is kind of language where we're explaining why. We explain why varied practice is suitable for open skills in netball. Okay, so let's put that in. This is because, let me show you the language I'm using to make sure I'm explaining why. This is because netball is a broadly open skill. Okay, not entirely open. Like we talked about penalty shot, for example. Broadly open skill involving an ever-changing environment. Okay, so I'm basically describing my open skill type of conditions. And, nice term coming up here, try and use it, a high perceptual load. Now, I've probably already done enough there to get my 3 marks. How? Because my exam is going to go, okay, it's broadly open, ever-changing environment, and it's high perceptual load. Okay, so I'm probably going to get my 3 marks that way. But I just want to keep going. I'm going to say, therefore, comma, and then I want to put my justification. Varied practice allows these open skills, to be worked on and get ready for this, and schemas, those of you that study schema theory can go further with that idea, and schemas to be broadened. Now a schema is a stored plan of a movement stored in the long-term memory, and it is generalized, okay, so we can adapt it in numerous ways. But first of all, notice that I've explained why. I've said because, and this means therefore, comma, and I've explained I've got more than enough content in there. For those of you that do study schemas, it's a nice term to get into your answer, because by broadening schemas, of course, we're improving the tendency for that skill to be adjustable in an ever-changing environment in the future. Okay, let's have a look at this. I've chopped off my D of externally paced. Let's just make sure we can see what we're trying to do here. Bear with me a second, folks. So sorry. There we go, that's better. Okay, so we're talking about here the notion of the pacing continuum. So let me write that in here. The pacing continuum. Okay, we need to go a little bit faster than the first time round here. So let's look at what we would describe as self-paced skills. With self-paced skills, I really want you guys to grasp, this is a really important term actually, that the performer controls the start of the movement. Lovely. The performer controls the start of the movement. And also, I'll come back to the application of this in a second. The performer controls the speed, or what we might call the rate of movement. Okay, so in other words, the performer decides when the movement starts and what rate it follows. Okay, now you can probably think of a lot of activities and skills in sport that don't follow that pattern, and of course they are not going to be closed skills, which self-paced skills tend to be very closely related to closed skills. Okay, so habitual, non-perceptual skills. So let's have a think about this. The performer controls the start of the movement. Now you might be thinking, well, James, the performer always controls the start of the movement. That is true, but what if I write this term in for you over here? What if I say to you here, for externally paced skills, the performer starts based on action of others. Interesting. Okay, so let's think about a wicket keeper, I don't know, or a slip fielder in cricket, or a fielder in rounders or something like that. When does the performer raise their hand to catch the ball? Well, they choose, I'm going to raise my hands, or I'm going to lower them, or whatever, but they're doing it on the basis of the action of others. The bowler delivers the ball, the batsperson strikes the ball, and it comes towards them. All of those things have to externally pace the performance of the skill, who then starts it based on the action of others. And that is very different to something like a javelin throw, which is paced by the individual, or a long jump, or something like a free throw in basketball. It's paced by the individual. They decide the start of the movement. Now, of course, there are limitations in that. You have to do it within a certain time frame. There are some limitations, but broadly speaking, that's what we're talking about. With externally paced skills, we're talking about a changing environment. A changing environment. Okay, so it's a changing environment, and broadly speaking, we are talking about open skills. There are exceptions. Broadly speaking, we're talking about open skills. Of course, we are again talking about adjustment. So those of you that do study schema theory can adopt that within this particular understanding. And certainly within, I think you Edexcel guys who look at schema theory, and you look at the idea of the two forms of closed loop control as a great example of how an externally paced skill would be controlled. And finally, I like this description, this one, the environment dictates the rate of the movement. Okay, you might be thinking, well, how can that be? Well, let's go back to our catching example. If we're catching a ball, the rate at which we move our hands into the correct position is dictated by the speed and the angle of the ball, not by, I whimsically feel like putting my hands up at this rate. No, I have to get my hands there in time in order to catch it or not. So that's essential. Now, let's take our performers. We've got our netball. Let's take specifically netball passing. She's passing here. So passing in netball is over here. Okay, so it is externally paced. Why? Because it has to be to a recipient. We have to time it and sequence it in relation to where the defender's positioning and timing is. So passing is over here. It is an externally paced skill. Something like sprinting is self-paced. Okay, the exception to that, of course, is the start, which of course is paced by the gun. Something like triathlon you'll find is often very closely related to something like sprinting. It's an athletic event ultimately. So triathlon again is self-paced. There are exceptions, you sprint finish to try and pip an opponent to the line. There are exceptions, but broadly speaking, let's have a look at Laura's gymnastics routine. Again, this is self-paced. Let's put floor routine in here. I'm not meaning to go particularly nearer the middle here, but floor routine in here. I could have put it further to the left. Okay, floor routine. And then we've got our tennis example. Okay, so it depends what we're doing with tennis. But with tennis, again, we're going to put it here towards externally paced. The vast majority of the shots in tennis are paced by the placement of the ball by the opponent and the position of the opponent. So therefore, tennis externally paced. The exception, of course, we could put something like the serve down here. Okay, the serve is down here. That's the exception, right? Okay, nice. Let's have a look now at what we would call the continuity continuum. Good name. The continuity continuum. My handwriting, guys, I really have to apologise. It's appalling today. I'm sorry. I hope it's legible for you. I'm trying to go a bit too fast, I think. Okay, so let's take discrete skills first of all. Discrete skills have what we would call a clear beginning, double N, a clear beginning and end. Okay, so a discrete skill. Discrete means on its own. Okay, discrete means on its own. So a clear beginning and end to a skill. So think about a service action, for example, in tennis. It starts with being in the ready position for the serve, and then it ends with kind of the landing of the feet back on the court when the ball's flying off, hopefully to get an ace down the other end. So that discrete skill, that's clearly a discrete skill. And another way to think about a discrete skill you have to start it again if required. Okay, so if you need to serve again, you have to start the service action over again. Think about the second serve, and we often find that these are practiced through massed practice. Okay, so think about something like shooting in netball or basketball or whatever. We would take a shot, repeat the shot, repeat the shot, repeat the shot, repeat the shot. And the tendency is to do that without breaks, and we call that, of course, mass practice. Now, continuous down the other end is a different concept. So here we're going to say no clear beginning and end. No clear beginning and end. We're going to say here. We're going to say here. End of, I love this sentence, end of one movement is the start of the next. So think about something is the start of the next. So think about something like a running technique, a cycling technique, literally cycling. You press the pedal down with one foot and it's coming up with the other, you press down, you press up, and you press down, and you pull up. So these are all continuous skills because the end of one movement is effectively the start of another. The end of the service action is not the start of another serve in tennis, right? And we also have down the middle, we have this notion of a serial skill. And these are what we describe as discrete skills linked together. To perform linked skills or discrete skills linked together to perform the whole movement. Okay, so think about something like our gymnastics floor routine. It's a balance, it's a leap, it's a turn, it's a spin, and they're all linked together to produce a serial movement. We like to describe them as linked series. It's a nice way of thinking about it, and we tend to practice them using the principles of either chaining, which you can of course call progressive part practice, and we can practice them through what we call backwards chaining, and I'll mention that again in a few moments time. So let's look at our examples. What do we have? Well, let's take our netball practice. Let's take our netball performance. If we were to take passing is discrete. If we were to take the running in netball, it's continuous. So we've got different features of the sport that are structured in different ways. You can even make an argument for a centre in netball to be relatively serial. They take the centre pass, then they move to receive the ball again, then they defend their opponent. They link things together. So you need to be specific there. Sprinting is continuous. Triathlon is continuous. Yes, I know you can say to me, well, there's 3 different parts and you have to change over, so therefore those are serial. But they're like 45 minutes each. Okay, so within each of those blocks it's continuous. All right, the gymnastics floor routine is serial. Why? Because you practice the leap, then you chain onto that the balance, then you chain onto that the throw of the ball, then you chain onto that the catch. Okay, so a floor routine is serial. And tennis is a really interesting one. It depends. If we were to take a tennis serve, we describe it as, I don't know what I've written. If we were to take the tennis serve, we would say it was a discrete skill on its own. But if we were to take something like a tennis rally, it becomes a serial skill, but it involves the running that is kind of continuous. So we've got to be specific with what we're talking about with the tennis example. Are we talking about the serve? Are we talking about the entire point? Are we talking about the entire match? And then, of course, we get a different answer based on what we are specifically referring to. Let's look at some questions. Let me just make this slightly bigger again, which makes me very nervous doing this thing while we're doing this live, because I often mess it up when I do this. So let's have a look. Same question. Select 2. I'm only going to be marked for 2, so I must select the first 2. Select 2 of these 5 skills. Place both on the continuum provided and justify. Give reasons why for the placement of each. So let's do the first things first. Let's do this first. I put the answers in advance. And by the way, I ran out of space as well, as you can see here. Okay, so I have put E, which is Laura's gym routine, as a self-paced skill down here. It's a self-paced skill. She initiates the start and end. Whereas we've got B, which is our netball passing. We've got that as an externally paced skill. Why? we've got here, so let's say that our placement is correct. That gets us a mark. A rhythmic gymnastic routine is self-paced because, so I'm giving reasons why, Laura initiates and controls the rate. Nice. Of the movement. Netball passing is externally paced because, again, I'm justifying, the environment dictates the start and the rate of the movement. I get my mark and I've got my max. So I'm clearly answering the question set. I'm placing and I'm justifying. I'm saying what I'm placing on the continuum and I'm justifying. By the way, continua is simply the plural of continuum. So we have one continuum and we have two continua. Okay, so we have two continua, just in case you're unsure of why that's that way. So next, exactly the same. So we're going to take our question here. Let's have a look what we've got. We have got E, which is again our gymnastics floor routine. We're saying it's serial because it's discrete elements linked together. And C, our triathlon, is continuous. So we get our mark there for correctly positioning. The floor routine is serial because, I'm justifying, it is a series of discrete elements linked together. There's my mark. Cycling is continuous because there is no clear beginning and end. Max. Beautiful. And I've performed my role. Why and how? Because I've managed to understand and be able to place correctly and incorporate my key descriptive language in my answers. Now, this is an interesting question. Explain why. So again, we're going to be because, this means, therefore, comma. Explain why Laura's floor routine might be practiced using the principle of chaining. Now, just one thing on chaining. We are talking here about progressive part practice. Okay, that's what we're referring to. Okay, we're not doing it specifically within this topic, but it's linked to this topic. It's linked. It is serial to this. Yes. Okay, let's have a look at the answer. So what I've done here is I've put the black text is simply like the filler, if you like. It's the structure. The orange text is my language, which I'm using to explain why, because, therefore, comma, this means. I'm clearly explaining why. And the green is effectively the correct answer. So this is because the routine is serial. So we use chaining. Why? Because the routine is serial and involves numerous discrete elements linked together. So now I'm actually stating what serial means. Therefore, comma, Laura can practice a leap. So I've got element A until perfected and then link it onto element B, which is a roll. Okay? And we've got our mark there. This means Laura can gradually link all the elements together in a series. And I get my max. Now, the only thing I think is a weakness of my answer there is I didn't mention the term progressive part practice. Now, just one thing, we could be talking about chaining, and I said I'd mentioned to you backwards chaining. Backwards chaining is exactly the same principle. You practice element A and you perfect it, then you move on to element B and so on. Then you move on to element A and B, then you perfect element A and B, and then you move on to element A and B and C until you perfect that chain. The only difference with backwards chaining is you start with Z. So you perfect part Z and then you perfect part Y and Z together. You perfect that, then you perfect together X, Y, and Z together, and you go backwards. So you start with the end of the performance. And lots of performers report that can be really effective for them because they're always culminating the performance as effectively as possible. It's actually an interesting principle. Okay, let us focus on operant conditioning. And the first point I want to address with you is I want to kind of give you a sentence which I think is going to really help you to understand this. And it is this one. It is a set stimulus elicits a set response. Okay, and you might want to sort of read that through a few times. So we're saying here that if we train somebody to do so, we can take a particular circumstance, a stimulus or a combination of stimuli, and we can encourage that performer to produce a set response in that situation or with those specific circumstances around them. So this becomes very close to a notion of programming. Okay, now some of you also study classical conditioning, so I don't want to go too much down that line. Some of you don't. But programming, almost like in a computer design, we have a set of instructions out, and the computer, the program, produces a set response. And we're thinking about learning through operant conditioning in this way. We also want to say about this particular sort of assumption is that this can be, and get ready for these words here, it can be grooved, and my O's look like, or my V, that make a V a bit more V-like, can be grooved, honed, or sometimes what we call overlearned. And what we mean by that is if we repeat and practice this response to this particular stimulus or set of stimuli over and over again, it becomes groove, honed, or a nice term we can pick up is overlearned. Now, you might want to immediately think about a weakness in this particular mentality, this particular learning paradigm, in the sense that we are not writing down here that the performer understands the reason why they're doing what they're doing. They've just learned to respond that way. So we can automatically produce a criticism of this model. Now, we also want to describe this as learning through experimentation. Learning through experimentation. And when we say experimentation, what we mean by that really is a key term for us with regard to operant conditioning, and that is the notion of trial and error learning. Okay, trial and error learning. And really what we are ideally looking to seek here is a set of circumstances and conditions which drive the individual to produce the right response, the correct response in a particular set of circumstances. So we've got this idea that we've got a set stimulus elicits a set response. We've got this idea that we learn through experimentation or trial and error learning. And where I really want to go through this is what we call manipulating the environment. Manipulating the environment. And really we're talking about the coach or the trainer here, that the coach or the trainer is going to produce an environmental set of conditions which bring about this trial and error learning to bring about the correct set response to those stimuli. Okay, so we call it manipulating the environment. We can refer to this as behavior shaping. Behavior shaping. And we can refer to it as, or we can describe it as needing reinforcement. And we can often say repetition, much of which in a second. Let me write that properly. Need for reinforcement. And I'll talk to you about reinforcement in a moment. Okay, so we've got these central ideas. We've got these central ideas of structuring a learning environment to produce a set of stimuli which elicit a particular set of response, and the learner gets to that correct response through trial and error learning. The coach ensures that happens through manipulating the environment and shaping the behavior of the learner. And what we're saying here is that this learning needs reinforcement. Now, I want to focus us for a moment on what we'd call the SR bond. Now, of course, what we've talked about up here, a set stimulus elicits a set response. We can refer to that as the SR bond, or what we're going to call now the stimulus response bond. Now, really, what I tend to think about with this theory is what we're looking for is almost the stimulus correct response bond, the stimulus correct response bond. We're looking for the athlete to produce the correct responses to a particular set of stimuli. Now, as we've said before, of course, what we're trying to do is we're trying to strengthen this bond, okay? So assuming for a second that we are looking at the correct response to a set of stimuli, we want to strengthen and thicken this bond between the two things so that reproduction of that correct response is much more likely. And we can only do that, according to operant conditioning, through the trial and error manipulated environment behavior shaping model. But we can also strengthen this bond, as I said a moment ago, through the processes of reinforcement. And I want to just quickly address reinforcement with you now, okay? So let's address reinforcement, all right? So reinforcement, we effectively have three types, okay? We have positive reinforcement. Now, the important role of positive reinforcement is it performs a function that we describe as strengthening the SR bond. So it's exactly what I just described, strengthening the SR bond, okay? And of course, when we're talking about positive reinforcement, we are talking about things like encouragement. We are talking about things like praise. We are talking about affirmations, things that inform the participant that their response was the correct one. And of course, what's the outcome of that? Well, as we said a moment ago, this bond between the set of stimuli and the response becomes stronger, thicker, more dominant, and therefore the correct response is more likely to occur. So positive reinforcement can be really, really effective for that reason, can be super effective for that reason. Now, negative reinforcement is something completely different. Negative reinforcement we describe, as what we describe as removing the criticism. Removing the criticism. Okay, so removing the criticism. And what we're saying by this, so if you think about it, what we would do there is, let's say we've put a performer in a set of, so let's say we've taken Tom here and we've put him in a set of circumstances where we're looking for him to produce the correct forehand technique, up down the line forehand drive shot, for example, and we've set the situation up so perhaps he's hitting into a channel, perhaps he's moving to his left through a pair of cones. We're shaping the environment in that way, and of course what we're going to do is that as he makes mistakes with that, we're going to be saying to Tom, okay Tom, try and move your left foot first please. Okay Tom, this time I want you to rotate your core a little bit further. Okay, this time Tom, I want you to follow through with a higher follow through over your right shoulder, and so on and so on and so on. But at the point where he does the skill correctly, we remove this criticism, and this is a super important point. Get ready for it. It forms the SR bond. It forms the SR bond. The SR bond is actually formed within that environment. So in other words, the first time the correct response is initiated, the criticism is removed, and all of a sudden we've got a new stimulus response bond. It needs strengthening, which is why at the moment of negative reinforcement we'll often include positive reinforcement as a replacement. Now punishment, I'm going to do this not in yellow, so it's not going to show through, so I'll do it in a blue colour. So punishment is a completely different concept, of course. It is the idea of weakening an SR bond. Okay, so if an SR bond has been built up by mistake, we've got the incorrect response to a particular stimulus or set of stimuli, then of course we'll use punishment like criticism, like substituting, like not selecting. These sorts of things would actually weaken the SR bond between the stimulus and the response that the performer's actually producing. Just one second, folks. I'm just going to turn the microphone off just for a moment because I need to sneeze. One moment, please. Okay, guys, sorry about that. Somebody actually told me this morning that people are really suffering from hay fever at the moment. There's a lot of pollen around, and I have to say my eyes are watering and my nose is running. I need to sneeze, so I don't know if that's what I'm experiencing, but there may be other occasions where I need to just take a moment there, so please forgive me for that. I obviously don't plan for that to happen, but this stuff's live, so it can be the case, right? But at the moment, I can barely see my tablet because my eyes are streaming so much. Never mind. Let's move on. I want to talk to you about Thorndike's laws. Now, let me just advise you that if on your course you do study classical conditioning, you do need to think about Thorndike's laws in relation to classical conditioning. Here, we're going to present it more as a general concept which supports our idea of reinforcement within the operant conditioning model. But Thorndike's laws are ultimately also featured in the concepts of classical conditioning. So if it's on your course, just be aware of that. So, all that being understood, let's have a look at the law of exercise. Thorndike, who, by the way, I have some serious problems with, not because of this particular set of ideas, which I think are pretty reliable, but because of the impact that Thorndike, you may not know who Thorndike is, and that's fine, but Thorndike is one of the most prominent educational psychologists that's ever lived. Died a very, very wealthy man, from basically dictating that education should be based on the divergence from the average. Now, I'm not going to go into that in any more detail, but it's a really fascinating area, and I happen to completely disagree with him. But there you go, that's for another day. Now, let's talk about Thorndike and his 3 laws. So he described the law of exercise, and this said something very simple. I think you'll recognize it. Repetition strengthens, there's an R in there somewhere, strengthens the SR bond. So again, if we think that we want to hone, groove, overlearn a skill, this law of exercise states that, in effect, that the more we repeat it, and hopefully the correct response to the stimulus, but the more we repeat that, the stronger the SR bond is literally going to become. Okay, so that makes, I think, a lot of sense to us. We've also got the law of effort. Okay, so we've got, guys, this is a mistake. This should say the law of effect. Okay, the law of effect. Okay, so let's get that right. Reinforcement, as we've just talked about it, reinforcement strengthens the SR bond. Now, again, we're not going to be surprised by that. And we already know that specifically its positive reinforcement which strengthens or weakens it. And of course, what we're talking about weakening the SR bond, we're talking about a form of punishment that would do that. And then we've got what we call the law of readiness. And the law of readiness states learning occurs only if the nervous and muscular system systems are mature enough. Okay, are mature enough. Okay, so let's hope that that's the case. So, but what it means there, in terms of the law of readiness, what we're saying there is that the practice conditions and the response which is expected from the learners needs to be at a level which is at the physical maturity of the individual concerned. So, of course, if we're looking for a correct throwing technique and we hand an 8-year-old an 800-gram full-size javelin, of course, that's not going to work particularly well because they're not going to be of the physical maturity in their muscular nervous systems to produce that outcome. So we've got to take that into account also. All right, so we've got some nice work there. Let's have a look at our practice questions, and we've got these in place already. Okay, so let's have a little look, guys. I'm afraid I'm going to need to pause again. I'm so sorry. Okay, sorry, folks. That isn't good, right? Okay, let's have a look at this question. Explain how is our command. Explain how. So again, we already know with explain how questions, we're going to be using terms like through. Well, so-and-so happens through the following. We're going to be using terms like by, this happens by the following. That's how we explain how things. We may also use therefore, comma, this means. This kind of language is going to be very common in this type of answer. Explain how Tom's coach could use a knowledge of operant conditioning to improve his volleying technique. So we want to apply it to volleying in this case, so we want to give some examples of that, but how could operant conditioning actually be done in that way? And I've prepared the answer in advance for you, so if you're actually, even if you're watching this live, you can actually pause on the DVR. When I put this answer in here, you might just want to pause and have a read of it, especially if you're on demand. If you're on the live stream, of course, you may want to keep up with me talking about it and doing it that way. But as I put it in, I'll just take a couple of moments of silence just for you to have the opportunity to pause that. Okay, so let me have a little look. I mean, if you're on the live stream, just hang on and we'll go over it together, all right? So I'm assuming you've had a read of that, or if you're on the live stream, you haven't, and you just wait for me. But let's go through, explain how Tom's could use a knowledge of operant condition to improve his volleying technique. So the coach could do this by, and okay, I'm in explain how mode, manipulating the environment. There's one of our key pieces of language from operant condition. We're looking for 4, by the way. So that Tom's volleying technique is shaped, behavior shaping, to being correct through trial and error learning. So I'm getting all of my key language into my explanation of how this will be done within this environment. Okay, an example, and we want to relate it to Tom's volleying, of course, could be placing a marked area on the court, which is where Tom should volley from. Now, I might get a mark for that. I'm shaping the environment, so we've got Tom's kind of volleying position correct. Or placing targets on the court where Tom should be aiming. I'm shaping his behavior. I may well be getting my mark for that. This means he strengthens the correct SR bond. Okay, and let me give it for that one and I'll get my max. So what have I done there? I've used my key language to explain how Tom's coach could do this, and I've given examples from the specific area that I've been asked to talk about. So again, I think that answer would actually be worth, if there was 6 available, I'd probably get 6. But in this case, I'm looking to pick up 4. I've got at least 4 key terms which are related to the content, and I've related those in a practical example which is relevant. Okay, justify. Justify is a really interesting command word, okay? With justify, we're tending to say things like the reason for this, the reason for this. We can say things like I believe. You can say things like, it's one of the only commands that allows you to do this actually, I think, another reason, and so on. Okay, so this is the kind of language we're using in a justify question. Justify the use of operant conditioning in the coaching of tennis to beginners. So we're specifically looking to justify with operant conditioning for beginners. So we have to almost find criticisms in other theories which operant conditioning kind of fixes for us. Let's see what we've got. Let's see what we've got here. So let's see. Let's uncover the same here. I'll just pause for a second as I put the answer in. So I'm assuming you've read that if you're not just following live. So the reason for this, so I'm in my justify model. The reason for this, just the orange doesn't have significance other than it's kind of like it's language of the key skill. The reason for this is to create and strengthen the correct SR bond. So create and strengthen the correct SR bond. Okay, let's just link those two things up. Another reason is the operant condition does not require intrinsic feedback, so we do not need the performer requiring the intrinsic feedback, which of course beginners don't yet have. They don't yet have the intrinsic feeling of the correct skill, nor an understanding of the skill. So they don't need an understanding of the skill, which of course cognitive stage learners often don't have. And novices have not developed this yet, as I just said. Because of this, the coach can manipulate the environment to shape the behaviors of the novice learner. Okay, and there's our max. I'd probably get a mark there if I needed it, but I've got my 4. So I'm clearly justifying the use of operant conditioning, clearly for beginners. I'm using my key language within the answer. So it's actually a nice summary at this point, right? Can you use your key topic language to get to the answer within the skill that's been requested of you within the question? You might notice when I do these things, I'm really specific. If I'm asked to explain how, let me tell you, I'm explaining how. If I'm asked to justify, I am justifying. If I'm asked to describe, which I think we might have one in a minute, I am going to describe, okay? I am going to perform that skill. And hopefully that is exactly what your exam board is expecting. Because of course, if they've put it in the question, one would like to think that is the skill that you're going to be honoured for. Now, you might say to me, well, James, it doesn't matter. I don't get any marks by saying by or through or this means. That's true. But the way it works for me is the answer in this case is that I'm thinking through a paradigm, like a modality, a mode. I'm explaining how, and it draws out of me the key knowledge which is relevant to that question. So you might want to think about, even when you learn something new, you study university or do something next year or whatever, or you're preparing for one of your other exams, you might want to think, right, here's the key content relating to a particular topic area, right? How does that work? Or how does that influence? Or how can that be applied? When you're thinking about something like evaluation, say, like you might ask your teacher, Miss, Sir, whatever you call them, what are the disadvantages of this? Are there any weaknesses to this theory? If you're not asking those questions, you're not preparing for, in this case, in this example, evaluate. For teachers out there, if we're not building in the skills of asking questions like how, why, are there any weaknesses, what's the disadvantages, what's the advantages, if we're not building those into our classroom experiences, we're not preparing our students to perform these particular skills. So that's something we all need, I think, to reflect on and focus on. Something that I've been doing a lot better in my own teaching in recent years. Anyway, I'm banging on. I'll stop there. Okay, let's have a look at social learning theory, or what we're going to call probably from here, the theories of observational learning. So a couple of things just to get us sort of started off the bat. We probably already know that this is strongly influenced by the work of a psychologist called Albert Bandura. Very, very well renowned, very well respected, still going. And this predominantly is around his work and his writing. Okay, so just a couple of things I'd also say about that. Bear in mind that we sometimes call it situational learning. So you may see this term. Don't be too sort of surprised if that happens to you. We can even, on occasion, see it labelled as environmental learning. Okay, so just be prepared for those terms, just in the case of a stinker of a question where they use that language rather than social learning or observational learning theory. Okay, so just in case. Now, the main point I want to get to is to say the following, and is to say that according to this theory, people learn by observing others. By observing others. Okay, fine. People learn by observing others. That seems to make sense. And we'd also say that this is what we'd call contrary to the behaviourist theories. And we, of course, just have looked at one behaviourist theory in the form of operant conditioning, but there are others. Piaget, fraud. That was a Freudian slip. Piaget, Freud, classical conditioning. These are classic examples of behaviourist theory. So observational learning is a divergence away from that sort of notion that we learn like a computer. Okay, so let's think about it in that way. Now, I just want to quickly address the ideas of others. Who are others? Well, we want to understand that others are what we would call models. So you notice here, we've said that we learn from observing others. Well, who are these others? Well, they're models. We can describe them as role models, so feel free to build that language into your answer. It is the process itself is called modeling. Okay, so we model our behavior on that of others, and we can refer to it as significant others. So significant others are going to be classic examples, going to be people like parents, of course, but it can be a respected sports coach or teacher, for example. Will model our behavior on these particular individuals. And I also want to develop one other aspect of this before we get into Bandura's model, and that is the notion of the demonstration. So I want to quickly talk about the demonstration itself, because of course as soon as we look at observational learning, it makes us as sort of sports scientists think directly towards the role of demonstration within the learning experience of learners within coaching. So a couple of things about demonstration. First of all, it is the creation of a visual image, which is great. Okay, so demonstration helps the learners to create a visual image. Link that to cognitive stage learners and the need for the visual or the mental picture, if you like. We also want to think about with the demonstration, the demonstrator needs to provide a message which is relevant to the learner. Okay, so it's important that the demonstration is something that the learner actually values. So I don't know, is this a bad example from a sports science perspective, but a relevant example for us today? Me demonstrating these theories to you now, a few days away from your exam, probably feels quite relevant, right? If I was to tell this to you, I don't know, when on your 50th birthday, when you're not thinking about these things anymore, or maybe you will be, but you know what I mean? It's probably going to be a lot less relevant, and the demonstration is going to be less meaningful to you, I guess. Okay, and it's the same with sort of a sporting demonstration. Is the technique or the behavior which the model is representing, is it relevant to the learners? Are the learners applying it in their sporting context? Do they want to learn it? So that, of course, is important. We want to take into account what we call the accuracy factor of the demonstration, and what we mean by this is what is the quality of the demonstration. Okay, does the demonstration produce the correct technique which can be then copied? Other points about the demonstration, we're interested in the status of the model. Okay, and what we mean by that is that if the model who's doing the demonstration is well respected by those observing, then it's more likely they're going to take that on. We've already talked about the law of readiness today, but we're talking about as well physical and mental readiness. So what I mean by that is the demonstration which is being provided, are the learners actually in a physical and mental ready state to receive that information and to reproduce that movement? And again, we talked about the law of readiness with Thorndike a little bit earlier on. Unless you're watching this on demand later and you don't know what I'm talking about, have a look at the section I did where we looked at operant conditioning. And finally, it's based on the motivation of learners, more of which in a second. Okay, so demonstrations are effective when learners are motivated to actually observe the demonstration. Now, all that being said, Bandura designed a 4-part theory. So let's see it in its spectacular, glowing beauty over here. And the first thing I want to say to you, guys, I'm really, really struggling with my watering eyes. I'm really going to need to ask for your patience here. Please forgive me, because I can barely see my screen. My handwriting is likely to be really shocking. We do these things live, so the conditions are the conditions. I'm afraid I'm doing my utmost to get this right for you. Okay, so these two features of Bandura's model are what we call the perceptual features. Okay, so this is perception, interpretation of the environment. Think of the DCR process. These are perceptual features, whereas these two features down here, these are what we refer to as psychomotor features. So here, first of all, we're just going to separate our 4-part model into 2 chunks of 2. It's a nice way, and we'll come back to that point in a moment. But what we want to do really is we want to focus, what we're saying here is that attention really needs to be drawn towards the demonstration that's been done. How do we draw attention of the observers to the demonstration? And these are the key points that I would get across to you. First of all, we need to combine demonstration with what we call CPs. They are coaching points. So we draw it. So here's my demonstration of a perfect tennis serve. Unlikely coming from me, but there you go. So here's my demonstration of a perfect tennis serve. Now note the angle of my elbow as I draw my racket back. Can you see how that improves the quality of the tension to a feature of the demonstration? Otherwise, I'm looking at this whole movement and I might miss the key factor that the coach wants me to address. So coaching points in combination. Secondly, encourage the performers to avoid distraction. Okay, so avoid distraction. We do not want external noise. We do not want learners looking into the sunlight. We do not want, for example, lots of noise from another coaching session right next to us. We want to avoid the distraction so that the observers can look at the demonstration and not be distracted. We've said already, this is about this point, focus on key aspects. Okay, so that is obviously partly in relation to our coaching points, but with particular parts, we could demonstrate simply the foot placement of a layup technique in basketball, for example. We're not worried about what their arms are doing at this point, just where the feet land. Okay, so that would be an interesting one. Focus on key aspects. We need to encourage our athletes towards the process of selective attention. Remind yourself, this is ignoring what's irrelevant and focusing hard on what is relevant. It is a perceptual feature of our information processing. And of course, we want the demonstrator to be, and we've looked at this already, a significant other. In other words, someone that the observers respect and want to listen from and learn from. Now, retention takes us on to a completely different model. It's all about the quality. So, excuse me a second, guys. It's all about the quality so that the image that the observers have seen is retained in the mind. Okay, so how do we maximize that? Well, first of all, it's a very obvious point. We create a visual image. Obviously, a demonstration is going to achieve that. Secondly, we want things to be really clear. Okay, so clarity is really important to increase retention of the image. So let me just give you what might seem like a very base example. Let's take my tennis serve for a second. Okay, I said I wanted the observers to focus on my elbow angle. Could I wear, for example, a red band around my right elbow, which is my striking elbow, to draw attention and make it clearer that that's what we're talking about? Or have a red sleeve, say, when the rest of me, I don't know, is wearing a black t-shirt or something, to bring attention to that arm. Could we do that? Okay, that would make it work. And we can also do that in that's where things like video analysis work well. And we might actually annotate over a demonstration. Look, here's the arrow pointing to the elbow, for example. So these things work. Now, I've already touched on this. Brightness. It may sound like a really base point, but we make the image more retainable by making it bright. We also encourage performers to go through the process of mental rehearsal before they go through physical practice. And you'll actually see this. This is a classic, right, where you demonstrate something, let's say in a PE lesson to a group of students or a group of learners, or in a coaching session to a group of performers. And those performers will, before they go and practice it, will actually run through that episode in their mind. You might even sort of see them mimicking an arm movement or a foot movement. Mental rehearsal helps with retention. And as we've said already, and I'm running out of space, I'll put it under here, we need to combine the image with what we call verbal guidance. And again, I come back to the notion up here of coaching points. Let's move on to motor reproduction now, into the psychomotor side. We've said already that we need the performers to be physically and mentally ready, or let's put mature, mentally mature. Okay, so we mean by that whatever's being asked of the performers when they go and reproduce the skill, practice it, they have to actually physically and mentally be capable of doing that. Otherwise, it's going to lead to failure, right? So we call that the law of readiness. Okay, so there's a nice link to our Thorndike's laws we looked at earlier on. If you haven't seen that, you need to. The other thing about motor reproduction is it really helps if we develop with the athlete understanding. Now, this is where operant conditioning fails, of course, because it doesn't develop understanding. Oh, guys, I'm so sorry. It doesn't develop understanding in our athletes. Okay, so I'm just trying to wipe my eyes clear of, just my eyes are watering terribly. My physical maturity or my physical readiness to do this at this very moment is not quite right. Just bear with me a second, guys. I don't want to disturb you with loads of sniffling noise. It must be disgusting. So we've got the need to develop understanding. And of course, one of the ways we do this is that athletes, as they're practicing, need feedback. Okay, they need feedback. Okay, so as the performance is going, lots of external, extrinsic feedback coming from the coach. Okay, now I'm going to use kind of a blue color to do this yellow because it's not going to work on the white. So let's have a look at the idea of motivation. Motivation to reproduce and repeat the skill. We know about the law of effects and the need for repetition. So of course we are looking here for reinforcement. Reinforcement increases the tendency for performers to repeat the performance because they're motivated to do so. So we need to use reinforcement. Therefore, things like praise are super important. And we need to increase drive. Let me rewrite that. Increase drive. Okay, so part of increasing drive is, as what we've said before, make it relevant, make it clear, make it enjoyable, make sure that the performers are ready to perform this thing. But one way of increasing drive is to say that you need to repeat this thing. And that, of course, leads to this increasing in motivation to reproduce the skill in the form of repetition. So this is Bandura's model. It's quite a comprehensive model. It works. And guys, I'm just going to take the briefest pause before we do the answer demonstrations because I need to just blow my nose and things. Just bear with me a second. So this is going well, huh? I do apologise, folks. I am genuinely doing my best here. I'm sure you realise. Okay, let's have a look at some practice questions. Making reference to Bandura's social learning theory, which we know about, we're being asked to describe, more of which in a second, describe the factors that would make a demonstration effective to help Tom improve his ground strokes. So, look, on the idea of describing, first of all, we need to use language such as is characterised by. That's indicative of describing. Is composed of. We say things like is like. We say things like is not when we're talking about the opposite. This is what we do when we're describing. Notice I'm not using things like because. Notice I'm not using things like therefore, comma. This means. Okay, I'm describing this thing. I'm not being asked to explain how and why. I'm describing it. Describing means give the main details, to give the main details. So it's a nice thing to realise because describing, therefore, is quite a straightforward skill that we can get lots of marks for quickly. Well, marks for quickly, about lots of marks, but we can get marks for quickly because we can give the characteristics of what it is we're talking about. In this case, the factors that make a demonstration effective. And of course, we already know that the factors that make a demonstration effective is this bunch of stuff over here. Okay, so we can get that into our answer. So let's have a little look at what we've got. So let's put the answer in. Again, I'll pause for a moment so you can have a read, okay? So I'm assuming you've had a little read of that. You may have paused, you may not have, so let's assume that you have. If you need to pause for a bit longer, you can even pause it on the live stream if you need to. According to Bandura, so I'm just making my reference to Bandura. I mean, it is not going to get me any credit, but there you go. People learn from observing others demonstrate behaviours. So I'm saying this is what Bandura's main argument was. Would I get a mark for that? Let's give myself benefit of the doubt. Good demonstrations are characterised by, look, are characterised by, so here are the characteristics, the accuracy factor and the status of the role model, as well as the relevance to the learner. Now notice, I wasn't asked explain how you would make a demonstration most effective, in which case I'd say make the accuracy factor as high as possible, make it hyper accurate, make the status of the role model as high as possible, make the relevance to the learners as relevant as possible. I'm asked to describe the factors that would make a demonstration effective, including their physical and mental readiness. I'm probably going to get credit there if I wasn't already at max. Okay, so I'm using my descriptive language to describe, in this case, through giving the characteristics of the factors. Okay, what are the factors that would make demonstration effective? Okay, so that's a nice answer. I'm giving the characteristics. I'm not going on to evaluate. I'm not going on to analyze. I'm not going on to compare. I'm describing. And if that's what I'm asked to do, that is what I'm going to do. Now, this is a different situation altogether. And by the way, we have not got enough space in this particular sheet of paper here to write a whole 15 or 20 mark response. Okay. However, we've been asked the question here to evaluate. Can I remind all of you that when we evaluate, we are saying things like a strength is, a weakness is, one advantage is on the one hand, so this is all indicative. On the other hand, this is all indicative of the fact that I am thinking through an evaluative lens. Okay, so I'm giving strengths, weaknesses, advantages, disadvantages. I'm saying things like however, so on the other side of things, however, comma. I'm saying things like comma space, whereas, and so on, comma space, whereas. I'm using this language to give both sides of an argument. So we must look at a concept from both directions, from the positive and from the negative. Now I'm going to give you a sample part of some sentences which could feature in this question. Evaluate Bandura's social learning theory as a model for explaining how people learn movement skills. So I'm simply going to give you 4 or 5 sentences which are going to be contained within this example. And of course, what you then need to do is you need to take that skill of evaluating and you need to discuss that with your teacher. Right, teacher, do I need to give a full description of the theory? Do I draw it out as my first thing? Do I go through each of the stages? And that varies on which exam board you're studying on. Now, for me, what I would do here is I would put all of my knowledge down around social learning theory in the structure of an evaluation. Okay, that would be my model. That's how I would write this answer. But for now, let's just have a little look at some examples. So let's have a look at sentence number 1. A strength of Bandura's model. So I'm immediately evaluating. Notice I haven't bothered with an introduction here. A strength of Bandura's model is that it explains how a learner goes from observing a demo all the way to motivation to repeat that behavior. A weakness is that it does not take into account how behavior shaping can influence learning. So let's just think about that for a second. I'm saying that a strength of it is that you watch a demo and you go all the way to the motivation. So Bandura explained all of that, and that's accurate. But a weakness is that it doesn't describe behavior shaping. Okay, so it doesn't describe the behaviorist stimulus response bond ideas that we looked at, for example, through operant conditioning or classical conditioning, if you study that one too. So we've clearly got an evaluative statement there. We've clearly got an evaluative statement. Let's have a look at another one. On the one hand, Bandura clearly describes how people learn from vicarious experiences. New term for us. Vicarious experience means learning through the process of modelling on others' behaviours. In fact, I should have written it up here. Let's do that now. So let's put that in here. From others. We call this vicarious experiences. Vicarious experiences. We should have written that in there, really. Vicarious experiences. So Bandura explains this. He says, on the one hand, Bandura clearly describes how people learn from vicarious experiences. On the other hand, it fails to acknowledge the role of innate abilities. So this theory does not recognize ability or innate factors as features of how people learn things. Okay, now it depends on how you stand on that, but it's certainly a weakness of the theory. It doesn't actually identify those possibilities at all. Let's have a look at another evaluative statement. I'm going to show you 4. A strength of the theory is it separates attention and retention into perceptual process and motor reproduction and motivation into psychomotor processes. Okay. However, it takes no account of the individual's personality type. Okay, so I'm clearly making an evaluative statement which is beyond just describing this theory. Within this answer, I'm almost certainly going to describe the theory as well. I'm going to say the 4 stages are: a demonstration is effective by, and so on and so on. Make sure you get your coaching points for retention. Make sure it's bright and clear for retention, and so on, all those points. But I've got to make my evaluative statement. Could an example of an evaluative statement be that Bandura stated that demonstrations are effective, so the strength is that demonstrations can cause learning. However, a weakness is that the demonstrations need to be bright and clear for the demonstration to be effective. There's a classic example of an evaluative statement, and we keep going and we keep going and we keep going. Now, what we always do at the end of an evaluative question or evaluative answer is we always place a conclusion. So I've just made a little conclusion here. In conclusion, Bandura's theory does an excellent job of explaining the role of vicarious processes, but must be viewed in combination with other learning theories. Okay, so that's my conclusion. It must be viewed in combination with other learning theories. Now, let me just repeat to you, Nobody have a go at me for saying that is a whole 20 mark or 15 mark answer. No, I'm giving you a sample of some of the sentence structures that I would hope that you would use within a response to that. I repeat again, I'm not going to bore you by taking this and this and this and this and placing it just by describing it into the answer. I want to show you how we take those things and form them into evaluative statements, and that is the higher level skill, of course, is to form them into evaluative statements. So if you have a look at how I've done that within that part answer, you can get a bit of a clue for that. Do remember that you must make a conclusion with an evaluation question. I think if you get like a question which asks you to evaluate for 4 or 5 marks, you probably don't need to do a conclusion for that. But if certainly in your extended writing, you must make a conclusion. Things like analyze questions don't really lend themselves to conclusions, because when you are analysing, we're breaking down and explaining things. Here, we've got to make some kind of judgment at the end because it's an evaluation. Okay, so we encourage you to do that. Okay, so we've got this really big topic of personality. You might hear me rustling my paper in the background because I've got a lot of notes with me for this particular session, because I kind of choose which bits to tell you and which bits to skim over a little bit, because this is a huge topic area. So all that being said, let's make a start on it. I want to talk to you about trait theory straight away. And I guess we need to just address the idea here. I'm asking, can personality predict sporting success? Okay, so that's the basic premise of my conversation with you here. And what is the relationship between personality and sporting success? It's kind of what I'm trying to get to. With regard to trait theory, which I'm confident you guys have probably got a bit of a solid understanding of already, I want to introduce you to a part formula first of all. Remember, we're going to look at interactionism later in the B equals FPE, but remember that a trait theorist would argue that behavior, in other words personality, is a function of personality. Okay, so it would be B equals FP. So what that means is that someone's behavior, what comes out of them in terms of their behaviors, is directly related to their personality. And in this sense, the personality is what they would describe as innate. Okay, and we can use the term inherited in the sense that it's in one's genetic kind of makeup where that personality comes from. I like to sometimes use the term as well, preformed. Okay, so start to think about this a second. We are suggesting, according to trait theory, that a personality is preformed and is a natural inclination. It is a natural inclination. Okay, so that is a really interesting phenomenon, because that would help us to explain. If we saw that some people could and some people never could in terms of sport or any other aspect of life, trait theory would help us to explain that. We also describe trait theory as stable. Now, stable or stability is a temporal factor. What we mean is it's in relation to time. So we're saying with stable, it means that sorry, let me rephrase that. It's a spatial factor, stability. So in other words, what we mean there is it's going to be in all situations. Sorry, I got my stable and my enduring mixed up. I'm going to talk about enduring right now. And we also describe trait theory as enduring. Okay, in other words, it's going to be long-term, or what we might refer to as permanent. So trait theory suggests that personality, the mask, the persona, the notion of behaviors balanced with values and beliefs, comes from these factors. Now, I'd immediately sort of try and ask you to think about criticizing that. Could we argue, for example, that this is too simplistic? Could we argue, for example, that this doesn't take into account social learning? Could we argue, for example, that this doesn't help explain how people behave differently in different situations? It doesn't answer those points. So in an evaluative sense, more of which in a second, we could be quite critical of this structure. Now, I also want to specifically talk to you about the model developed by Eysenck and Cattell, and I'm confident it's not completely new to you, and we've got a representation over here. And I'd first of all ask you to think, well, if we are arguing that, or if we're reflecting for a second on the notion of sporting success, as I mentioned before, where would we believe in terms of Eysenck and Cattell's two continua, where would we believe that sporting success might be exhibited? Now, let me remind you that stability, this is about the consistency of behavior. So let's just write the word consistency in here. consistency of behaviors. Okay, so of course a neurotic type character is likely to have very, very changeable behaviors. Okay, so we've got sort of changeable, but we also relate this to commonly stressed behavior. Okay, so behavior changes based on stress, whereas the stable type personality is more consistent. The introverted type character over here we know as shy, quiet, not too sociable, thoughtful, these kind of ideas. And extroverted, we are talking about outgoing, we're talking about confident, we're talking about sociable, we're talking about communicative, not always making sense, but communicative. So where therefore would you argue that Isaac and Cantell might have believed that sporting success, in fact they would have related it also to life success, business success, would have been positioned, and of course they would have argued that it was this character here which was most had the most natural inclination or the most preformed tendency to actually be successful in sport. And it gets quite close to what we'd call the Giordano narrowband approach, the type A, type B type personality. So here, the stable extrovert, let's label it as a stable extrovert. I know some of you have learned the names of the four personality types in the different quadrants here. I'm not going to get into that today. But this personality type is one that these researchers at least argued represented success. And so if this is success, that would mean that if we could measure these behaviors in people or observe these behaviors in people, we could even, for example, develop a selection policy which was representative of that idea. It's not just about the best performer, it's about those that are extroverted but stable and consistent within that extroversion. Okay, so another word you might want to use here is someone who would be predictable. Okay, someone who would be predictable. Okay, now, only other things I'd say about Isaac and Cantell in this very short study here, bear in mind we could go into a massive amount more detail given more time. The only other thing I would say is that Isaac and Cantell, I think it was Isaac individually, introduced a third measure in terms of the way he developed his 16PF, and it was the notion of tough-mindedness. So of course, if we then think about that in relation to sport and success, we are looking for, according to these guys, extroversion, stability, and the notion of tough-mindedness could help to predict sporting success. Now, let's move on from that. So B equals FP, I've kind of touched on here. Remember what I'm saying? We're saying that according to these theorists, and if you guys study Giordano as well, narrowband type A, type B personality, you can include this in here. They argue that behaviors are a direct function of personality. Okay, so in other words, this personality is consistent and stable, and our behaviors come out as a representation of that personality. Okay, so that's what our trait theorists would argue. Now, social learning theory has, of course, a completely different perspective on this. Social learning theory, we would take an equivalent equation and look at B equals FE. What does that mean? It means that behaviors equal a function. I should have written function. A function of the, and this is where our E comes in, of the environment. So a social learning theorist, a pure social learning theorist, would argue that a human being's behaviors were directly related and were a function of singularly the notion of the environment. And that leads us to a really interesting discussion of social learning. So how does this then work? Well, we learn through observation of others. Okay, so we learn through observation of others. We talked about this a bit yesterday if you did our session on learning. We learn through the process of modeling. Okay, and I'm going to talk about attitudes later on in this session, but we learn through the process of modeling. Therefore, people who are important to us and our personality and our behaviors are people like role models, parents, in the sporting context, coaches, teachers, this kind of thing. We model our behaviors on these role models, and then it comes down to a process of reinforcement as to whether these behaviors are likely to be exhibited again in the future. Okay, so we also call this, just so you guys are aware, we also call this observational learning. Okay, so observational theory. okay, or social learning theory, as we've said already. And of course, we must mention the theorist Albert Bandura, who we talked about at quite a bit of detail yesterday. Okay, so this is the idea that behavior is purely learned from one's environment. Now, again, can we criticize this theory? Can we say, okay, this fails to take into account what appears to be someone's kind of biological predisposition? Could we criticize this theory by saying, well, look, brothers and sisters who seem to grow up in the same environment, remember, they often come out very, very different. Now, the social learning theorists would argue, well, the situation isn't the same. So this situationalism, according to Bandura and other theorists, can explain these differences in personality, these differences in behavior. So we effectively have two direct opponents, right? We have trait theory, which states that behavior is a direct function of one's biology. And we have social learning theory, which states that behavior, personality, is a direct function of environmental influences. Now, I would simply ask you guys the question of controllability. Is that got two L's in it? Controllability. So let's think about from the performer's perspective, the teacher's perspective, the coach's perspective, the trainer's perspective, which of these theories is useful for them to actually apply within their settings. And you can make a pretty solid argument that social learning theory is the most effective model to actually use day to day, because it suggests that high quality environmental interactions are going to lead to learning and changes. So that is why I think a lot of educators, a lot of coaches, a lot of sports kind of elite level sports coaches will use underpinning their work, they'll use something like social learning theory as a strong feature of their work. Why? Because it's controllable and it doesn't kind of give up the variables as trait theory would. Well, it's just how it is, it's just natural. So that in itself is kind of an interesting one, I would argue. Let me think if I want to make any other points about this. Oh, I should have mentioned the word socialization. Forgive me, guys, this is actually a really important word, socialization. And socialization is the process of learning norms of society. Okay, so learning norms. So that's a key process in here. And I talked about modeling there. I should have also used the word copying. Okay, so we learn our behaviors by copying and modeling others. And remember that notion of reinforcement. Don't forget that reinforcement has its three format: positive, negative, and punishment. If you want more details on that, go back to the work that I did on learning, which I talked about in the live stream yesterday, or it's available on demand on the YouTube channel if you're taking this there. Now then, where we want to get to before we do some answers is the notion of interactionism. And interactionism suggests that behaviors are a function of, and then we've got, of course, personality, meaning innate personality and the environment. So an interactionist and the environment. So an interactionist is going to make an argument here that we actually have a combination. Okay, so a combination of theories is the best one. Combination of theories is the best one to explain the relationship between behaviors and how behaviors come out and how they're developed in an individual. So they're saying it's both innate personality and the environment. And this interactionism, of course, is a really interesting concept because it tries to take or steal or borrow the best of the theories that we've just briefly looked at and combine them together to explain how something like a personality could lead to sporting success or anything else for that matter. Now, I don't think I've missed a little area here. I want to quickly talk to you. Let me actually put my toolbar in here. I wasn't actually planning to do it. Where's my toolbar? Let me actually show you one of these interactionist theories. So I'm going to show you the theory developed by Hollander. I'm going to show you it quickly here. So I should have prepared this. It's not going to be as pretty as it could be because I haven't kind of got this just right. So Hollander suggested. Whoops, guys, bear with me a second. I didn't switch off my toolbar. There we go. So Hollander, I'm getting there now. Hollander in the 1970s, I believe it was 1976 specifically, he suggested a theory to work like this. He argued that yes, personality or behaviors were a function of both innate personality and the environment. And he identified that there were 3 layers of this. There's what we call the psychological core. This is the most intimate inner aspects of one's identity. And this relates to, let me just put core up here, this relates to values. Values. Oh my. This relates to values. This relates to beliefs. So it's the innermost sort of central identity of an individual. Now here on the second layer, we have what we call typical responses. And this helps to explain how, so I'll put this up here as TR, typical responses. This is the most likely behavior of an individual. And we can argue that this, to an extent, is still based on what Hollander would argue was the innate psychological core. And he then argued we had a third layer of our behaviors, and they're what we call role-related behaviors. And these are sort of outward facing. So, okay, if we put RRB up here, and they are specific to the situation. And Hollander argued effectively that you can explain why someone is completely different in different situations, because to some degree, the individual is honouring one part of this model or other. So in the typical responses, this area here, the individual is representing their inner core. They're behaving exactly as their psychological core suggests based on their values and beliefs. But the role-related behaviours is kind of outward facing. It takes into account the situation and puts on the behaviour based on that situation. And it shows really how behaviours can be unpredictable in an individual. People can change. So people can go from day-to-day life and they're completely calm and normal, and they can go into, and I've had numerous athletes I've worked with in this way, they can go into the sporting environment and change completely, either to become from relaxed to hyper focused and intense, or from being calm and passive to being aggressive and vicious. You know, these sorts of things can change, and Hollander really expressed these. Now, of course, we have to take into account what is the strength and intensity of the role-related behaviour? What is required of the individual? The stronger that requirement is, the more likely the individual is to follow that model. How strong are these psychological core beliefs? The stronger they are, the more likely the behaviour is to follow those. Okay, so let's have a look at some questions. I've already taken too much time. Question 1. Julie, who's our netball player, by the way, is a successful netball player and an extrovert. Okay. Evaluate. Okay, let's think about that word in a second. Evaluate trait theory of personality as a model for explaining Julie's sporting success. Evaluate, remember, is to look at both sides of an argument and to reach a conclusion. So we are going to be definitely including in our answer things like strengths of the model, weaknesses. We're going to be saying things like, on the one hand, on the other hand, an advantage of the theory is, a disadvantage of the theory is, and so on and so on. So let's have a little look at that. First answer going in. You can pause this, including on the live stream if you need to, and take your time. If you're on demand, pause it, have a read, and then come and then hit play again when we're ready to go. A strength of trait theory, so I'm straight away in the evaluative model. I'm not bothering with an introduction, I'm straight into evaluation. A strength is that it provides a relationship between extroversion and sporting success. So it seems to make a link between the two. So that's helpful. A weakness is that it completely fails to explain the role of social learning. So I've looked at one side, I've looked at another. It does suggest a relationship, it doesn't take into account learning. Okay, fine, I've made 2 points, I'm evaluating, I'm clearly performing that skill. Next part. On the one hand, comma, trait theory is simple and very easy to apply. Okay, that's an advantage. On the other hand, comma, it is clearly an overgeneralization, okay, and does not apply to a wide range of athletes, okay, so it does not apply to enough people for us to consider it kind of like a rule. Let's keep going. A weakness, again, I've gone weakness first this time. A weakness of trait theory is that athletes do not seem to change. Athletes do seem to change with their experiences, and of course, trait theory doesn't take that into account. Now, where's the weakness in my answer? A couple of things. First of all, if we're doing an evaluation, we really should reach a conclusion. Secondly, I've got 6 marks available here, and how many points have I made? 5. So here we've got a solid answer, but it doesn't go far enough in my answer. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, I stopped at that point because I was a bit pushed for time, and not least, I kind of ran out of space. Kind of real exam situations, right? But I want to remind you that if you're asked this 6-mark question, then you've got to be confident you're making at least 6 evaluative points. And remember, depends on the specific question, I think sometimes, but you really should reach a conclusion in an evaluation. Why? Because you're looking at both sides of an argument and you should reach a conclusion. Okay, that's part of an evaluative process structure and even a way of thinking. Let's look at this next question. Interactionism can be summarized using the equation B equals FPE. We agree. Describe Hollander's model of personality. And of course, we could have a real good go of that because we've got it here. But let me remind you that when we are talking about describing, we're saying is characterized by, is composed of, and so on. We're looking at the character, we're giving the main details of the theory. So let's have a look at what we've got here. Hollander's model is composed of, so I'm saying what it has, an inner psychological core. So I'm going to get my mark there for stating that, which represents the values, identities, and beliefs. So I go a bit further with my description. I could get another mark for that. Now, I may well have a sub-max at that point because the mark scheme may well say, right, you can only get 2 marks maximum for this bit, 2 marks maximum for this bit, and 2 marks maximum for this bit, okay? So it might be that it works like that, but I get my 2 sub-max there. Let's keep going. The typical responses into the middle. I don't know, I'm annoyed I put that big red squirrel on there, actually. Can I undo that? Let me get rid of this. I want to get rid of my squirrels. Okay, good. Now, I haven't deleted the answer, have I, folks? No, it's there. The typical responses are the most likely behavior. So first of all, I've got typical responses are the most likely behavioral responses of the individual and are based on the psychological core. Most likely is probably going to get me a mark, but I'm going to just say for now that I'm going to put that down as vague so I don't get my 4th mark, my final mark there. And I go on to the last part. Finally, the role-related behaviours explain how, so there's my role-related behaviours, and they explain how an individual's behaviour changes in relation to the role. And there I get my max. Now, I've probably marked that a bit harshly in truth there. I've probably had 2 marks in between, really, and I would have got to my max, but I wanted to use that last point. Why? Because I've given a bit more detail about each of those phases. Now, how could we criticise that answer that I just made? Okay, the first thing I would ask you is, should I have drawn? And what's your answer to that? What if I drew my answer into that question? Anything wrong with that? And I would argue, discuss this with your teachers if you want. If you want to check with your exam board, feel free to do it. But I would argue it would be completely legitimate to draw your answer. In fact, I personally think that the ideal situation is to put this description in and to draw the thing in your answer as well. Okay, so if you've got time and you've got space, I would encourage you to draw these things, okay? It hasn't asked me to illustrate, in which case I must do that, but I don't see a reason why I wouldn't illustrate if I had the time and space to do so. Okay, let's now address attitudes. And again, it's another big topic, so probably pushing you guys quite hard in this hour today, especially if you're on the live stream and trying to keep up. So first of all, I want to talk about the source of attitudes. And of course, we have a lot of them. And first of all, let's sort of break these down. So firstly, I want to talk about past experiences. This is a classic example of a source of attitude. And you guys can relate to this, right? So you can look at these either on the positive or the negative side on attitudes. But if we take something like a lack of fun doing, I don't know, swimming, say, or trampolining or whatever, what is that going to lead to in terms of the attitude? It's common sense, right? You already know it's going to become negative. What if we go through an experience of pain? First time you ever play rugby, you get a bash to the head and a concussion. Okay, that is of course going to be negative. What about if you've been put in danger before? You've been hill walking and you got lost in the mist. You know, that's going to have been a negative, and it's going to involve sort of a potentially negative attitude going forward. And if people experience fear within their past experiences, and these things can lead to negative, but please don't forget there can also be lots of fun. You know, it's a really joyous experience to be physically active. You know, you feel really safe, or you feel like really confident. It doesn't, I'm just posting them in the negative, you understand, just so we can sort of see the strength of these things. Now, We also want to talk about role models. Role models are really significant in the development of attitudes. Again, this is not going to be rocket science to you. You're going to understand this. So what our friends do, think, see, believe, that's going to be important to how it affects our attitudes. I'm a teenage... Let me rephrase this. Let's think about a teenage girl at the age of 15, and she enjoys playing football, but none of her friends do, and they don't support her, and they don't ask her about it, and they think she's strange to do it. What's the likely impact on that individual? Well, her continuation may be questionable, right? So it's an interesting one. I'm not saying that's common, by the way, just giving you an example. Parents are clearly really influential role models, and we're also talking about other adults, what impact they have. So again, other adults were particularly interested. It could be anyone, right? But we're talking about teachers in the sporting context, coaches. These are really important people to how young people develop attitudes. I want to talk to you about the notion of stereotypes. Okay, stereotypes. So a stereotype, as we've mentioned once already today, is a societal view, and it's often an ill-informed one. Okay, often, get nice word coming up for you, often erroneous. And what we mean by erroneous, it's based on an error. Okay, or it's not true, or at least it's an overgeneralization. They can often be gender role stereotypes. Girls shouldn't play football. Dance is not for boys. These things can come out as an example, and they can be race role stereotypes as well. The idea that people of African descent are not effective swimmers, for example. We could make the contrary argument for people of African descent being extremely fast runners, as an example. So these stereotypes influence people's attitudes. And finally, I'll squeeze it in over here. We've got the notion of societal norms. That's an N there, by the way. Societal norms. So think about societal norms for different genders. Think about societal culture and how different people from different cultures can see things differently. Ethnicity can, to some degree, have an impact. And the final one is tendency. Just what are the typical behaviours of children, adults in society? Now, of course, what we want to kind of look at here, what we want to look at more specifically, is we want to get into how sort of attitudes are structured within people. Okay, so how attitudes structured. Now, again, we could spend time looking at myth, stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, and self-fulfilling prophecy. I want to encourage you to have a little look at that yourselves, okay? But don't forget things like, the tendency for people to learn to be sedentary and inactive, the tendency for there to be a dropout rate in teenage years, the tendency for us to have things like stacking in certain sporting positions where predominantly only certain people of certain ethnicities are selected. A great example of that is men's football coaches. Okay, it is stacked towards white European males. Why is that? And then we've also got the process of socialization, learning society's norms. These are all very significant features. But where I really want to get to this notion of the triadic model of attitudes. And you're going to hear me rustling in the background here. Forgive me, folks, as I switch pieces of paper. Okay, so triadic model of attitudes. Basically what we're saying is we have got three components here. We have 1, we have 2, we have 3. Okay, and we need to understand that any attitude which ultimately will come out as a behavior, either through the things people say or the acts that they make, is representative of these three things. So let's just go over them. So number 1, let me put it over here. Number 1 is what we call the affective component. Now try and learn the word affective as relating to emotions. It's an emotional state. Okay, so affective, emotions and feelings. So if we were to have experienced things like fear, what about joy? If we were to experience things like happiness, what impact is that going to have on our attitude towards an attitude object? So if I take the sport of swimming as an example, if we take two different people, one who's experienced joy and fun and happiness when they go swimming, and another that was terrified because maybe they were pushed in the deep end and they were said, you've got to figure it out for yourself. What is that going to mean for that person's affective state with regard to the attitude object of swimming? Well, of course, they're going to be vastly different feelings, right? They're going to be vastly different feelings. If we take number two, I'm actually going to do number 2 last. I'll put it in here, but it's the one I often use as a summary, this behavioural one over here. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at 3, which is cognitive. Okay, cognitive. When we talk about cognitive, what we're talking about here is the knowledge that somebody holds about an attitude object. So let's keep with my example of swimming. Swimming is very good for my health if I go swimming 3 times a week. What is that knowledge likely to, or potentially at least, to have on my behaviour and my overall attitude? Well, it's going to suggest that I might be more inclined to do that. It's also about ideas. Okay, so ideas one holds in the mind. It's also about beliefs. Okay, so you can link this to the psychological core from Hollander if you like. So the beliefs here. So this cognitive part of the attitude is about what we know. It's not our feelings, it's about what we know. So let's just go over 2 of these facts. Let's go to a positive attitude. I've really enjoyed swimming in the past, and I know it's really healthy for me. And I can do it my whole life because it's not weight bearing and doesn't stress my joints. I can do this until I'm 90. That person's likely to have a positive attitude compared to someone who had a fear-based experience and they know that if I'm out of my depth, I'm going to be in trouble. So that is going to be a much more negative attitude towards the attitude object of swimming. And that's where the behavioural comes in as a nice last feature. And it's actually what we do. I think I chose the wrong yellow. What we do. And the way we'd say this is, classic examples are things like attending or not attending. It's going to be persistence, attending training, keep trying, work hard, persistence, or giving up, quitting. Okay, this is going to be the behavioural aspect. And the thing I would say to you guys is, can you kind of see that behavioural is reflective of this and this? So if if the affective and cognitive elements are negative, we're likely to get a behavioural element, which, for example, is giving up. Okay, so we've got this model which is in complete agreement, but it's an agreement on the negative side. Now, one other thing I'd just like to share with you at this point, before we get into it in more detail, let me just talk about changing an attitude. If we're looking to change someone's affective component, we need, let's say we're the coach or the trainer, we need to make it fun. Okay, so make it fun, make it relevant, make it, and also bring about success. Okay. So we want to keep the goals nice and simple, and we want to make it really enjoyable. Okay, so we might introduce it very gradually, make sure there's lots of success by the individual, and it's really happy, fun experiences. On the cognitive side, we might persuade the person. Okay, I know I'll drown if I am out of my depth. Well, actually, I'm going to come in with you, and I'm going to be right next to you, and we're going to be in the shallow end. So if at that point you're completely safe. Equally, if we do decide to go out of our depth, which we probably won't, I'm going to be there with you and we're going to use floats. Can you see how that would be persuading and convincing of somebody that they might be okay? And finally, on the behavioural side, we often talk about the idea of rewards. Okay, we try and structure people's behaviours. And let's keep the swimming example. Here's your badge or your certificate for doing your 25 metres or 50 metres or whatever it happens to be. Here's your fetching a brick from the bottom of the pool life-saving badge. We reward people to get the behaviour into the positive. Now, what I want to do before we have a look at some actual detailed answers on this, I want to look at 2 models of changing attitude. So first of all, it's the idea of cognitive dissonance. Dissonance simply means in disagreement. And we describe this as disrupting the triadic model. Disrupting the triadic model. In other words, we use cognitive dissonance theory to say, okay, last time you experienced fear, but we're going to use cognitive dissonance theory. By the next time we work with you on the tennis court, say, it's going to be a really joyous, fun experience. So we're going to make dissonance in that way. Now, this is an interesting point. Can be positive or negative. What do we mean by this? Well, remember that any attitude is made up of 3 parts, and those 3 parts can be negative, partially negative, positive, very positive. So we're actually looking to influence those ways to disrupt the model. Now, if an attitude is completely positive, then obviously we wouldn't worry about doing that. We're also talking about changing one element of the model. Okay, so let's assume for a second that Tom, our tennis player up here, he's got a really good. He knows that tennis is really good for him, and he should play more often. But he's afraid. He's got negative, and he's a bit afraid of being embarrassed because he's a bit overweight and doesn't want to be seen playing. Well, of course, that might mean that he doesn't attend. So what might we do there? Well, we might change this feeling by doing some one-on-one instruction when no one else is around after the session's end. Okay, that would be perhaps one way. He might feel more confident. Maybe it changes this to a tick and this to a tick, and then we go from there. Okay, so that would be one simple example. Now, finally, on the cognitive dissonance theory, we talk about this. So if we go to the cognitive element, we talk about this as a process of education. Okay, so if we think about it in relation to the cognitive part, the C, you're educating the person. If you're talking about it in relation to the affective, the A, the AF, then of course what you're saying there is make it fun. If you're talking about the behavioural, as I said before, then of course what we're talking about there is we use dissonance by creating some kind of rewards. Okay, so that's how we do that. Now, persuasive communication is a completely different, well, it's not completely different, it actually touches on this. So this one specifically influences the cognitive element. Okay, and I said before, if we want to change the cognitive element, we have to educate or we have to persuade. So it's about the C, the cognitive element. And this is the important thing about persuading someone that, they need to change their view. The person who's communicating needs to be high status, a role model, for want of a better term. Okay, a role model. Also, we need the message to be clear. Okay, clear message. Exactly, you don't need to be embarrassed because actually there's just going to be you and me there, Tom. So don't be embarrassed. Let's go for it. Okay, so that's going to change that. Okay, and finally, we've got the notion of what we'd call message relevance. Does the person you're looking to persuade actually want to receive that message? And if the answer is, of course, no, then it's kind of difficult, isn't it? But you've got to make that message relevant to the person receiving it. And one of the things about persuasive communication is that often you can't really educate or persuade until this effect, if someone's got like real fear-based stuff going on, you kind of have to deal with that first. So that cognitive dissonance theory, perhaps that comes before the persuasive communication in that case. I have to change the canvas because my questions are on a different one. I shall be straight back. Okay, and to finish off with today, we're going to have a look at some questions. So let's have a look at this one. Tom has developed... and what's happened there? Oh, a typo. I'm not a fan of typos. An excellent attitude to tennis. Good. Using specific examples, justify this statement. So we're going to give the reasons why. Justify this statement in relation to the triadic model of attitude. So we obviously have to talk about the triadic model here. So let's justify that statement. Let's have a little go at it. Again, you can pause this if you need to and read what I've put in. I'll put it in kind of statement at a time for you. Feel free to pause and go over what I've written. So the reasons for this, I'm justifying, are that Tom has a positive ABC. Okay, so maybe that's going to get me some credit. I'm looking for 6. A positive affective component is that Tom experiences positive feelings about tennis. Okay, so I'm picking up marks by talking about my affective. He enjoys it. I'm clarifying that point. Secondly, the positive C, B to follow, doing that thing where I always do A, C, B because it kind of helps me think about it, is that Tom knows that being active and practicing regularly is good for his health. This is cognitive. Okay, so there I'm talking about something he knows, it's a belief, it's knowledge, and it's the cognitive element. Okay, and I've put it within an example, haven't I? It's good for his health. So if I'm required to give an example in the answer, I'm giving the example. A positive behavioural component is that Tom chooses to play, attends practice 3 times a week, and persists in all his efforts. Okay, and we'd be on our max for that. I'd probably get the max for referring to the behavioural component, but I've clarified what that thing is. And it's really important that I've justified that. So I've given specific examples. Look, experiences positive feelings. It is also, he knows that being active and practicing regularly is good for his health. So I'm giving an example of that component. I'm saying here, he chooses to play, attends practice 3 times a week. I'm giving specific examples of how the behaviour comes out of him. Okay, so I'm giving my examples, not just putting my theory in. Next question, using a range of examples, explain how stereotypes can lead to negative attitudes. Now, so I've got to give more than one example of stereotypes. I've got to give a couple of examples here. Okay, so I'm going to sort of probably do some gender role, some race role stereotypes, this kind of thing. And I'm explaining how. Now, classics of explaining how, I'm going to use the words through and by. It happens through the following, it happens by the following. This is classic behaviour explaining how. Explain how stereotypes can lead to negative attitudes. Okay. So I'm just going to introduce. A stereotype is a societal view of a group of people and is a simplistic generalisation. Now let's get into our explaining bit. They are displayed through, I'm explaining how, gender role beliefs where people see rugby or football as not for girls, okay? So maybe I'm going to get my kind of mark here for gender role beliefs. I'll come back to that in a second. And through race role beliefs, like believing people of African descent are naturally faster than those of European descent. Now, you're going to say to me, you've only got 3 marks there. Well, my belief is that I would get a mark for gender role beliefs, and if I needed another one, through, where's it gone? I wrote race role beliefs here. Okay, but I've got my max, and I've given, importantly, I've given a range of examples. So I've given this idea of some sports being for girls and some for boys, that kind of traditional idea. I've given the stereotype that people of African descent are faster. So I've given that sort of that idea in there as well, and I've explained that and how that happens. So I've answered that question, the structure that question has asked me. Now, you could use other stereotypes within that, right? You could use other ones. I'm using those. Can I just sort of say something with you? I would prepare yourself for wording on this particular topic, okay? So obviously there's a certain sensitivity to talking about gender role stereotypes, for example. You know, you've got to be thinking through how you word things, because you want to make sure that your writing is written in a balanced and considered manner. So just reflect on that. There's nothing wrong, for example, you could include, like, as a gender role stereotype, we've got this traditional wording for talking about a physically active and games playing kind of athletic woman as a tomboy, right? So if you wrote in your answer, sometimes girls who play lots of sports can be viewed as, in inverted commas, tomboy, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you wrote something like, all girls that do sports, tomboys, obviously it's an unbalanced thing to say, and it's effectively replicating the stereotype. So you're not looking to replicate the stereotype, you're looking to describe it and its context. So I just encourage you to think, look, you guys know these things, you don't need me to point it out. Okay, let's have a look at the concepts of reaction time. And guys, I'm so sorry if you are an OCR student, this is kind of peripheral knowledge for you. So you may just want to make a call about whether you study this or not. It's not directly featured in your specification. So, you know, you may want to choose not to in that case. You're very welcome to stay and to take part. Of course you are. So let's look at our key terms here. Response time, first of all. I want us to understand that response time, as we see here, is reaction time plus movement time. So let's come back to this definition and let's define the other two. That should actually give us the definition of what response time is. So reaction time is what we call, is the onset to the start of the movement. So if we were sort of wording this out, we'd say reaction time is the time between the onset of the stimulus and the start of reaction in response to the stimulus. So it's the time between the onset of the information, let's say the b of the bang of the gun in athletics, say, and the first press off the blocks. Okay, so that would be the reaction time. Movement time, however, is the time between the start of the movement and the completion of the movement. So it actually comes after this point. Okay, so the movement time is the time taken between the start of the movement in response and the completion of that movement. So some people think, well, that's running the whole 100 meters. But what we mean here is this could be, we might define this as how long it takes for the feet to actually leave the blocks in athletics, for example. Not necessarily the whole race, but how long does it take to actually get our feet out of the blocks? So, of course, if we've got response time as both of these, what must it therefore be? Well, it's got to be the time between the onset of the stimulus and the completion of the movement. So the response time in athletics, let's say sprinting for argument's sake, is the time between the B of the bang and the clock starting and the feet leaving the blocks, if that's how we define that concept. Okay, so we just need to be able to differentiate those points, and it's useful in order to be able to do that. Now, one thing you might find interesting is if we just take reaction time for a second, if we look at the notion of, it's not going to come through, bro, if we take the notion of elite athletes, that reaction time, remember, just to initiate the movement, takes something between, generally speaking, it takes something between 0.1 seconds to 0.2 seconds. So this is a very, very quick process. Okay, so we need to understand that. And finally, I want you guys to understand that there's two types of reaction. Okay, so we have two types of reaction. The first one is what we call simple reactions. Okay, and we define a simple reaction by the notion that there is only one possibility or one possible response. Let's put it that way, the one possible response. So that's what we call a simple reaction time. So think about our sprinting example. There goes the bang of the gun. What are my choices here? Run. Okay, so I've got one possible response in that situation. But we also have, of course, a different notion of reaction. We also have what we call choice reaction. Choice reactions. These are really nice terms for you to internalize. This is where we have multiple possible responses. So of course we can't look at, I know you could say to me, well, you know, the sprinter could choose not to run, but okay, we're looking at sporting responses. So let's take a badminton. Let's just choose a racket sport. Let's choose badminton. You can put it in the context of tennis, whatever you like. In this model, perhaps the badminton player is served up. I don't mean with a serve. Is presented with a high mid-court shuttlecock. So really, the typical response to that is to kill it, is to smash. Okay, but they could, for example, if the opponent is expecting a smash, and they've got very quick reactions, for example, they may well use that to further position to further put the opponent out of position and push them to the back corner, for example, or to drop it in low. Now, so as a result of that, the performer has multiple choices of what they could do in that situation. Maybe one is more likely. I'd normally smash here, I'd normally kill the point, but actually, maybe in the last 3 points, I've gone to smash a number of times and the shuttlecock's been blocked back and I've ended up losing the point. So therefore, they've got choices within that environment to choose different options, and that's what we call a choice reaction. Now, Hick, bless him, went on to explain this in some detail. And Hick produced what I often refer to, and I encourage you to think about, as a bottleneck theory. A bottleneck theory. What, James? What are you talking about? So the idea of Hick's law basically says to us that as the number of possible responses or the number of possible solutions in a situation increases, the response time, remember reaction time plus movement time, the response time increases until it kind of plateaus. It gets to a sort of a saturation point. Okay, so we see here, if we take this point here, just for argument's sake, okay, let's call that one option. So there's one possible choice there. Notice that both this performer and this performer, their response time is what we might loosely call fast. Okay, if we get to here, for example, let's just use a very base idea. I mean, you've got to realize there's many. Let's just call this 10 options. There's 10 options at this point. Okay, now we track that up. Well, this performer is now responding at that speed, and this performer is responding at that speed. So obviously, in our choice reaction situation, it takes significantly longer, according to Hick, to actually respond through our movement, through our response time responses. That's not a very well put statement. The other thing we can say here is that this bottom curve represents what we call an expert. And of course, if we talk about someone as an expert, we can call them an autonomous stage learner. Those guys, they're going to react much faster total than someone who is untrained. So of course, up here we have what we'd call a novice, or we can of course call it a cognitive stage learner. They take much longer to respond. But the key point I want to get to you is that once we kind of reach this saturation point, the rest of the curve goes up very slowly. So let's call this 100 or 1,000,000 different possible choices. Basically, it's only slightly shorter than the 10 possible options, okay? Oh, sorry, it only takes slightly longer, I should say. So that's why we call it a bottleneck theory, because once the choices in choice reaction are very multiple, it effectively means that you're not going to react any more slowly, although we still get a sort of a gradual increase. Basically, the big losses are from having more than one option, single choice, single reactions, to choice reactions, multiple options. So that's where kind of we've got the idea there that choice reaction needs to be practiced in that environment, right? We need to get used to that skill. And of course, we can see the decision-making time, or the reaction time, the time for the information processing, what we call reaction time. It takes much longer for people who are unpracticed or untrained. So Hick gives us a really good insight into that concept. Let's move on. Now, I also want to talk to you about how we could sort of visualize simple and choice reaction. Remember, we've got this concept up here, simple reactions and choice reactions. How could we actually visualize that? Well, here, for example, we've got this notion, and we could put it into this sort of context. Maybe what we've got here, this is what we'd call a simple reaction. Okay, a simple reaction. Okay, simple reaction. This is example A. Look, the idea is that look here, this point here, this is the decision, this point here. Let's just put a little line across. Okay, and we notice, look, that if there's only one possible alternative, that process happens much faster. Okay, but on example B over here, what we have is choice reaction. Okay, choice reaction. By the way, we made these images. I'm really happy with them. But with choice reaction, of course, what we've got here is that all of these are possible alternative solutions to the problem. Let's argue that this one is the correct one. Okay, it takes longer for that to come down to the decision to be made, and for the decision to be translated into a movement response. And that starts to emphasize why choice reactions take longer. It starts to reassure us that Hick wasn't crazy, and that makes perfect intuitive common sense. So it's a nice way to visualize it. Now, one way we can shorten response times is we can use a model of anticipation. So let's make sure we understand what anticipation is. We're aiming to reduce reaction time, or we're aiming to increase the speed of information processing. Take a breath, James. So we've got two ways. We've got what we call spatial anticipation. And the way we like to think about this is it's what we call preloading a skill. Okay, now I don't know why. I always think about rounders or baseball or softball in this situation, or even a cricketer. And it's the idea of, right, that the bowler's about to bowl to me. I'm going to open my body and I'm going to play an open hand right-handed shot over first base head, or through the offside in cricket or something like that. You preload the skill. And what that means is that your alternative is being selected and makes it basically only one possible alternative. The problem with that, of course, is it might not be the right skill, but we call that spatial anticipation. And you might realize that you do it more than you think you do. We do that a lot in sport. And the second one is what we call temporal or time-based anticipation. And with temporal anticipation, it's what we call a prediction of the situation. Okay, so this could be, you're playing in tennis, for example, and your opponent has got a mid-court shot which puts them in a very attacking position. You have to predict. You have to in order to be able to get the ball back either on the backhand or the forehand side, you're going to have to make a prediction, and you notice your opponent opens their stance up and it appears they're going to hit an open forehand, so therefore you go to, if you're a right-hander, your backhand side. Okay, you predict the situation. Now, of course, you find many of the times that the opponent has made a fake, more of which in a second, and then whips the ball across to the other side. So we can predict the situation in order to get there faster, and it's called temporal anticipation. It doesn't work every single time, but it can be useful in a situation where either someone's very, very good at picking up the cues of the opponent, like the what do you call it, the tells of the opponent, or indeed if someone's in a defensive position and they're forced to make a decision. And remember that spatial is preloading the skill. Now, let's move on. Let's have a look at what we call the PRP. And of course, with PRP, we want to remind ourselves that this is what we call a psychological refractory period. And I have to say, there's never been a single occurrence in my teaching career that I've explained this and been happy with my explanation. So I'm kind of dreading this in some ways, but it's actually a super simple concept, but it's something that maybe we can get confused about. The applications are as follows. We're interested in how this helps us to understand the notion of throwing a dummy. Let me put that in inverted commas, actually. Throwing a dummy, okay? So it helps us understand why that works for us. It's how performers present fake information, which that wording's taken on new context in the world of fake news, or the concept of fake news in recent years, but it's how a performer will present fake information to their opponent, and they're trying to create what we'd call a delayed response in their opponent. I will contextualize this for you in a second, okay? And it's what we call the single channel hypothesis. Okay, and the single channel hypothesis basically says that a performer must complete their reaction to a stimulus before they start a second reaction to that stimulus. Okay, so let's have a look at how this works. What sport should we choose? Let's choose, what am I rubbish at? I'm rubbish at rugby, so let me choose rugby, okay? So the idea here is, let's imagine, let me do a dodgy old drawing. Let's imagine we've got player A over here, and player A has got the rugby ball. Look what a beautiful drawing that is. And they're running towards player B with that rugby ball, and player B, of course, wants to tackle player A. They want to, effectively take possession of the ball away from them. Okay, so how would this work in this environment with this beautifully drawn illustration? Well, first of all, let's just look at the structure of our illustration. Notice that time is passing to the right. Okay, we measure time in milliseconds. So realize immediately this is a super short period of time. We are not talking about excessive periods. We're not talking about seconds or minutes here. We're talking about quick, rapid changes. Okay, so let's say that our player, what did we say? It was player A. Our player A. Here's player A. Let's say that they start making this move, and they seem to be making a dodging move to their right. So they step off their left foot in that direction. Okay, that would be what we call stimulus 1. Now you probably realize that the reaction by player B is very likely, therefore, to make that move, right? That's what we call reaction 1. Reaction 1. They go to defend that run. Now, player A suddenly takes a hard step off their right foot and now darts to the left. Well, PRP theory tells us that player B, they have to complete this reaction. Okay, here's the completion of the reaction, this point here, before they can go and tackle player B with a second reaction. So look, here's the first move there. That's stimulus 1. If I was to track it down, look, there's stimulus 1. Here's the dart to the left. That's stimulus 2. Okay. Now reaction 1, which is player B's reaction to the first stimulus, doesn't end until this point here. So they can't divert back and defend the second run until this point here. So the new information is presented at this point. They start their reaction at this point, and as a result, they have this whole period of time where they're actually still completing reaction 1, which is the wrong reaction, at least for what's going to happen in the end. Meanwhile, the player's gone and round the corner and they run in and score a try, or they run in and pass off their shoulder or whatever. It might just be that they get enough distance that they can they still get tackled by this player, but they can pass out of the tackle, and therefore one of their teammates can go and score. Okay, so this produces this psychological refractory period, which is a period of time where the opponent, player B, is delayed in their response to the second stimulus. Why? Because they're still reacting with reaction 1. And that's the PRP. So let me take you back to why it's useful. It's useful because it explains why throwing a dummy works. It's useful because it encourages athletes to use fake information in their process. Go back to my badminton player in the mid-court. They look as if they're going to jump and smash and kill a shuttle, and they just drop in a drop shot cross-court to win the point close to the net. Okay? Classic examples. It produces a delayed response in the opponent, and it operates on what we call the single channel hypothesis, which says to us that a reaction has to be completed to stimulus 1 before the performer can start to react for reaction 2 to stimulus 2. And that's what we mean by the PRP. So it's a really nice theory. I encourage you to be able to describe it in the way that I've just described it. I encourage you even to be able to draw it if you have to. And I remind you that this is a feature of time. This here is a period of elapsed time, some quarter of a second or something. Okay, it's a period of milliseconds. It's elapsed time where the performer has got the wrong response to the stimulus, which is no longer relevant. Okay, I need to change the canvas because my question format is on another canvas. I shall be straight back with that. Now we're a little bit short of time. I've just been given the proper old hurry up here. So I'm going to do something slightly different with this particular question. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to plan it for you, and I want you to complete the answer. Okay, so let's do two things. With each of our answers, let's address the idea of, let me get rid of that actually. Let us address the idea of the skill or the command word. Okay, and let's then look at what the content would be within our answer. Okay, and I'll get you guys to actually submit your answer. So I'd be really grateful if you could actually write on your sheet, take a photo and whack it on Twitter for us, for example. We'd actually like to see these. Okay, so actually get these into us. So look, let's have a look at this as an example first of all. Explain how. When we're asked to explain how something happens, we're being asked to go through a process. So classic examples of terminology we will use within our sentences when we are explaining how. We're going to say it happens through and it happens by the following. And we also tend to use things like because, although we tend to use those more for explain why. And we often use therefore, comma, and this means. That's it. What have I done there? This means type language. Okay, so this is the kind of connective language that you guys are going to be using. What we're looking to explain how about is how could Tom, he's our tennis player of course, how could Tom benefit from a knowledge of the PRP in his tennis performances? So look, in terms of content for me, we are talking about dummies. We are talking about fakes. We are talking about delayed response, and we are talking about the single channel hypothesis. Okay, so could you guys get that content? There's 4 key points there, and of course you're going to describe the PRP as it happened as well, stimulus 1, reaction 1, stimulus 2, reaction 2, etc. Can you get this language into your answers in this structure? It happens through, it happens by, it happens because, therefore, this means. Can you get that into your answer? And could you show me a 5 marker? Okay, for that. I'd be really interested to see what you provide for me there. Secondly, and we've got a 6 mark question here. We've got look closely at this image. Thank you, I will. Analyze. Let me remind you what analyze means. It means to break down and explain something. Okay, now we're going to analyse the graph, making reference to the range of sporting performances. Okay, so obviously we're going to break it down to 3 parts. 1, 2, 3. That's how we're going to break this down and explain each part. So classic language, we're going to have things like, firstly, notice the comma. We're going to use things like secondly. We're going to use something like lastly or thirdly or ultimately or whatever. You're going to break this down. So firstly, this greeny bit. Secondly, this reddy pinky bit. Thirdly, lastly, this yellowy bit. And you're going to explain then what you're seeing. And when you're explaining something, what do we already use? We use through, by, because, therefore, this means. This is the kind of language we're going to have like this. So, analysing this first part, why does it increase rapidly here? Why does as number of choices goes up slightly, you get a dramatic increase in time? And in fact, there's an error on this graph. This should be milliseconds. Okay, this should be milliseconds there, not seconds. So why does it increase dramatically? Why does it start to level off in the second part? And why is it plateaued in the last part? Okay, can we use the language we just had within our discussion of Hick's law to go about this? So a couple of things that I would encourage you to include as part of your answer. Of course, you're going to mention Hick. I mean, it's in the question, so you're probably not going to get any marks for that. You're going to mention bottleneck. You're going to mention simple and choice reaction. You're going to mention overload, or what we might call saturation. You're going to mention RT equals, well, let's call it RT2 times movement time. Okay, so response time equals reaction time movement time. So you're going to talk about this concept here. You're going to talk about the plateau. You're going to talk about possible alternatives, and so on. And this answer is going to get you a nice structure, but what you're going to do is you're going to break it down into parts. Firstly, secondly, and lastly. Okay, or you may break it down to 4 if for some reason you might want to look at the axes or something, I suppose. But we've been given these 3 shadings, so we're going to use those 3 shadings. Can you use this content to to analyze, I should say, break down and explain, remembering that when you explain things, you should be using this language up here. I'm super interested to see what responses you guys can submit to us. Now, what I'll do is I'll put an answer in place, because we don't have time in this session today, and I'll include this at the start of our next session on leadership, so you've got my model answer basically, or maybe it'll be one of yours that one of you guys has submitted. We'll go from there, but I would like to see what you guys put in there. But if you see, maybe what's useful here is you see what process I would go through to answer these. Right, I look at the command and I look at the knowledge which is required, and I move forward on that basis. Can you guys do the same thing? Okay, so you've heard me banging on about leadership already. Let's actually address what leadership is, or at least what the skills are. And I would get those of you that study the leadership theories to consider where these skills come from. I mean, there has been a kind of a broad societal assumption that people have kind of, they have leadership. It's something in people. Many people hold that belief, others less so. I have to say, on a personal level, I'm one that's less so. I think these are behaviours that are developed, or at least responsive to an environment, at least to some degree. That's just my personal opinion. Okay, all that being said, let's have a look. What are we talking about? So we are talking about things like communication skills. I guess that becomes particularly relevant when we look at something like a democratic or person-oriented model. However, one of the purposes of the autocratic model is the clear message. So communication skills is important there as well, of course, and it kind of goes without saying. We are talking about high levels of motivation. Motivation's a really important point. I mean, we always write it as motivation, don't we? They need to be motivated and they need to share that motivation with others. That's absolutely true. One of the things I'm fascinated about in life is about the relationship between self-discipline and motivation. We could make a very strong argument that motivation is very, very temporary, whereas something like self-discipline is actually potentially very, very permanent. So it's something I'd get you to reflect on, but certainly the term high motivation is going to be useful to us. Another point, it seems obvious, but we are looking for an individual who shows enthusiasm. Okay, and what we mean by that is that they have energy for the work at hand. They're prepared to put things into the job. They display that approach behaviour all the time. We're also talking about an individual or a team of individuals with, sorry, I meant to write that differently. We're talking about a clear goal or a clear vision for what the group and the team is going to achieve. It's essential that they can communicate that clear goal and that clear vision. Another point, again, especially important for the democratic process, is the skill of empathy. Empathy is the skill of being able to recognize the experiences of others in others when you don't necessarily have that experience yourself. Okay, so empathizing is a useful skill. Understanding why someone is disappointed not to be selected. Understand why someone lost their rag today. Understanding why a performer is not committing as much as you think they should in their training. Trying to understand those things can help to good leadership skills, because it can lead to better conversations, I suppose, ultimately. A couple of other points. We're talking about someone who has or had a high technical performance. Okay, it gives credibility to someone, right? That they themselves are able or were able to perform at that level. So a high technical performance is important. There are lots of exceptions to that. And then we've got the notion of charisma. Now, I never know how to describe charisma. It's that sort of notion that people want to listen to that individual, right? They can grab attention, they can capture people. These are amongst some of the skills which we would argue are super important. Are super important for the leadership behaviour, and for the. Sorry, guys, I dropped a bit of paper. For the leader to actually display. A couple of other additional things. Empathy, of course, leads to caring, which is a nice word you can include in your answers. If you want, vision can lead to something like philosophy, having a playing competition philosophy or an identity we might talk about. We also could add in here the notion of relationships, someone who's capable of building lots of good relationships. Again, the democratic style is particularly relevant for that. And the other point really is just to re-emphasize this notion of high motivation. Often the energy will need to come from the leader, so it's important that we have that. All right, let's move on. We have got this model here, Sheladjara. At least that's how I pronounce it. Perhaps you say it differently. Don't be shocked if you see somewhere that's it's written Shelandjura. I've seen that in numerous places, but I'm using the model Sheladjara. Why? It's actually the correct one. So this is an interesting model, and we call it the multi-dimensional model. I'm going to address the entire construct here, and beyond that, we're going to have a look at answering a fairly challenging question about that. So, key things to me that I think we need to do. Let's start with the end in mind. We are looking to derive group satisfaction and group success. We can just simply describe that as better performances. Okay, so if we follow this model, the outcome, according to Sheladjara, is better performances. If we get better performances, we're more likely to be successful, the group's more likely to be satisfied, we're more likely to win. Okay, so better performances in that way. But it's not just about winning. I mean, we also look at people committing more, people persevering more, people enjoying it more. That's where that satisfaction point comes in. So we're looking at a model of leadership, or a series of behaviors and sensitivities that a leader can adopt to ensure that those things take place. So of course this therefore becomes a very valuable model in sport, right? So let's look at these different things. Let's look at situation first of all. By the situation here, we could be talking about a notion of favourableness. Okay, favourableness. Now, those of you that study Fiedler will know quite a lot about favourableness. Is it high? Is it low? With favourableness, we are talking about the strength of the leader's position, the levels of satisfaction of the group, the difficulty of the situation. The favourableness is the situation. Now, also, don't forget that this could also be practicalities. How many people are in the group? Is it a dangerous activity? Are they men and women? You said there might be a difference earlier, perhaps. These are also the practicalities of the situation. And the key point is this one. Depending on what the situation is, it's going to produce a certain required behaviour. So let's just keep this simple. Let's say that our situation is that we have a group of all women, because we have that part of our theory. They are doing a known activity. They're doing a known activity, something they've done before, and they are in a favourable or a moderately favourable situation in a not too large group. Well, what's that going to mean for our required behaviour? Well, in many cases, that's going to mean that the behaviour needs to be democratic. Okay? So in other words, that the leader should be sensitive enough to interpret the environment, the situation, and then recognise that the required behaviour, in the example I gave, a blunt one, would be democratic behaviour. If we change that, working with young males, 10 to 12 years old, in very large groups, doing that javelin throwing thing for the first time, then of course we're going to have a different required behaviour. So let's move on. I'm going to go jump down to the bottom here. Members are the following. They are team members. They are players or athletes. They could be staff. They could even be officials. And by that I'm talking about, chairperson, secretary, treasurer, all those guys, okay? So this is who we mean by the members. And what we're going to find from that group is they're going to have some notion of a preferred behaviour. Now let's assume for a second that these, let's say we're at a rugby club, let's do we're at a hockey club for argument's sake, and the players, the staff that kind of coach, and all of the officials, all of them, for some in some weird world, or the majority of them, they want an autocratic style. Right? We've had a difficult situation. We lost all our games last season. We need someone to come in and tell us what to do. Okay, so they have an autocratic style. Do you see now? If we look down here, we now have a disagreement, or what we call a dissonance. The required behaviour and the preferred behaviour could be different. Okay, and that, of course, it could lead to problems for the leader, but more importantly, what does it lead to for the leader? The need to be flexible. Okay, the need to be flexible. Now, finally, let's look at the leader characteristics. This could be in relation to their personality. It could be in relation to their experience, their previous success. It could be in relation to something like the strength of their position. Okay, strength of position, again, touching on notions of favourableness again. So the strength of the position. So let's assume for a second that the leader is more of a task-oriented kind of person. That's their personality. Their experience has been in that realm. That's what they've tended to do. And the strength of their position is really strong. So we're saying that their actual behaviour is probably going to be autocratic, or their tendency for behaviour is going to be autocratic, which suits the members, but perhaps the situation requires democracy. What that leads to is what we'd call a dissonant model. A dissonant model. And what we mean by that is that the required behaviour, the actual behaviour, and the preferred behaviour don't all agree. We have one, the required behaviour in the situation, is different to the preferred and the actual. So what does that mean for the leader? Let me write this in big letters. The leader must be flexible. So if you think that leadership behaviours are all one thing, Shaladrai would disagree with you. Shaladrai disagreed, and he would say the best leadership behaviours take into account the situation, the leader's characteristics themselves, and the members, and as a result of that, the leader produces an actual behaviour which is representative of balancing up those pressures. Okay, and if they get the right behaviour, remember, this could be momentary. This could be in 2 different moments, 2 different seconds. They might display a different style of leadership, shifting from democratic to autocratic to laissez-faire even. And what that's going to produce is a higher level of group satisfaction and group success. Now, if we have all 3 of these all the same, so the situation requires, let's say, democracy, the leader prefers a democratic style, the members prefer a democratic style, we have some words that represent that. When they don't agree, it's dissonant. So you can call them, there's 3 words that I've seen this described as. One is consonant, which is not, in this case, those things that Rachel Riley puts up on Countdown. You can call it congruent, and you can call it concordant. All 3 of those basically mean agreement between those 3 elements. But the key point is, because this model is dynamic, the situation changes, the members change or experiences change, the leader can be replaced, or you can add other skills into the leader. The situation is dynamic. So what does that mean for the leader? They must be flexible to achieve group success and to achieve group satisfaction. I finished with a flourish of a big red tick. I've scribbled all over that. My mind's kind of betraying me, and I can't remember exactly all the things I've said to make that mess on that screen, but you'll notice that. The only other thing I would say, and it looks awful now, but hopefully yours on your sheet will look better, is just notice that we've got these arrows here. So the situation does, of course, affect the preferred behaviour because the members are also part of the situation. The members, of course, do influence the required behaviour because a requirement that part of the situation is the members' involvement. So just be aware that those are in there. And you'll also see about 8 different versions of this model with arrows pointing in different places, but the basic principle is the same. Okay, let's move on. Let's look at this question. Let me make this slightly bigger, actually, because I like this question. So let's make this slightly bigger. How's that? A little bit better. Oh, so question. Laura, who's our rhythmic goodness, is our rhythmical gymnast. Is that the right way of phrasing that? And also Volta, if you read the notes. Laura's coach is responsible for over 50 elite gymnasts. That's a busy job. Making specific reference to Shaladri's model. So, of course, we're going to bring this back to Shaladri's multidimensional model, aren't we? Because we've been asked to explain why. What did we say before? Because this means we've also got therefore, comma, as a result, by, through. This is explaining language. Explain why she might choose an autocratic leadership behaviour. She might choose autocratic leadership behaviours during training. So what are the reasons why she might choose autocracy according to Shaladri? That's the question. So let's have a look. And I do want to give examples in my answer here as well, because it's specifically related to Laura's coach, so I should include Laura's coach in my answer. So let's have a little look here. Same rule, black is just kind of words and fluff. Orange is my language that I'm using to think through the skill of explaining why, and the green is the answer. This is because, notice, no introduction. I'm not waffling. I'm not going, Shaladri presented a multidimensional model. It had the so-and-so element. Don't bother. Okay, just answer. This is because the situational characteristics, boom, mark. Okay, so I'm already referring to Shaladri, leads to autocracy being the required behaviour. An example is, so now putting it into Laura's coach's example, that the practice drill is dangerous. Now, I wonder if I get a submax there, because if you think about what I've just done, is I've talked about this part of the model. Okay, so maybe there's a submax there. I can't get any more available. So submax, or involves the entire, hey, where's that? Why is that down there? I've left you open. Let me get rid of you. So, or it involves the entire group, so large numbers. I think so what did I had this here. Goodness me. Our canvas are all based on layers, and of course I was writing on the wrong layer in this case, so apologies. The required behaviour, both of these are getting me a mark. We had a dangerous, which got me a mark. It got me my submax. And of course I would get this if I didn't have my submax, but it's about the required behaviours and the situational characteristics, so I can't get my 1 because I've already got my 3. So let's move it on. Next little part. It is also because, I'm just using because again, the member characteristics, so I'm referring to Shaladri's model, actually prefer, okay, so we've got preferred behaviour, prefer the behaviour of autocracy. They like being told to do that extra repetition. Okay, so again, I've got my 3, I've got my submax. Okay, so that's how the coach would do it. They would use an autocratic route because it's preferred by the members. And an example of that would be one more repetition. Okay, nice. Then we've got, finally, this could be because, simply using because again, the leader's characteristics, okay, from Shaladri, are actually that their actual behaviours tend to be autocratic. So again, I've got my 8, I've got my max. Some of you might view this more as a 6-mark question depending on your exam structures. But I've gone through now the 3 horizontal sections of Shaladri's model. Now it could be that I get some more other submaxes in there, but we can go on and we can say, right, let's have a look at this last bit, which was present earlier. If the required preferred and actual behaviours are consonant, congruent, concordant as autocracy, this will mean, there's my explaining why skill, increased group satisfaction and group success. In other words, they're going to perform better. But I've already got my max. And I gave myself an extra, it was actually a 7-mark question. I thought it was an 8. So I got a max earlier. So maybe my submaxes would have been 2s perhaps rather than 3s. But you take my point. This is where I've answered the entire question. I've made reference to this whole thing, which is now too big on my screen. I've made reference to this in the entire thing and given examples of what it would mean for this gymnastics coach with her large group of 50 elite performers. In other words, I've done that. Equally, I've performed the skill of explaining why, because this means, therefore, comma, this is the skill I need to represent. Look how important the word because is when you explain why. It's so important. I mean, in many ways, I don't want to make this statement because I don't want to limit you in your writing. But if you're asked to explain why something happens, pretty much because is all you need. You know, it happens because. Why does X, Y, Z happen? Because. And then you answer. It doesn't take much more than that. But without you understanding that explaining why includes you making because statements, you could end up describing or stating or identifying something. We have to explain why if we're asked to do that. Okay, I think that's enough from me. I really feel like I rushed through that last question. You may want to drag back on the DVR if you're on demand, just have a look at the question in its own right and take a little bit more time over it. But as we're on the live show and time's a little bit short, I'll leave it there. Okay, so let's get started. And actually, for you guys, if any of you who are kind of used to watching my sessions in these revision periods, I wonder if some of you can notice something that's different about what I'm about to do today. There's going to be a particular difference, and I'll see if you can pick up on it. It's not significant, just in case you notice it stylistically. Okay, let's get on with it. We have a definition here of stress. It is as follows: negative feelings produced by perceived, much more of which in a second, physiological and psychological forces. So let us acknowledge that we consider stress to be a negative concept, okay, something that is harmful, does damage, especially if it's experienced long term, again, more of which in a moment, and it's a perception. And now, of course, when we talk about perception, we are talking about an interpretation, okay? It is part of our perceptual mechanism. It is an interpretation. Different people will perceive or interpret the same phenomena differently. Again, more of which in a second. But I'd also like to draw out that this is both a physiological experience and a psychological experience. So psychological pressures, psychological negativities, I don't like that word, they can lead to the experience of stress, but so can physiological issues. So physiological, we could be talking about things like fatigue, for example. We could be talking about things like injury. We could be talking about a lack of fitness as a physiological aspect which could lead to stress. I'm sure these things will make sense to you. Now, what I also want to sort of draw out from that is a distinction. And that distinction is as follows. We have from this definition a notion of stress. Okay, now we're saying that stress is, amongst other things, an experience of anxiety. Anxiety is like worry or apprehension, so that's a cognitive or psychological process, and it leads to what we would call inhibition. So think about your understanding of the word inhibition. To me, it means preventing or worsening. So in other words, stress is something in this context which is going to lead to a worsening or a negative impacting of something like performance. We could also be talking about motivation, for example, but certainly on performance. Now, and this is where the perceptual part becomes relevant. We can also look at the base experiences of stress, the psychological and physical experiences, and we can realize that we have this other notion which is called eustress. I never know how to say this. Eustress. Excuse me, eustress. I call it eustress. You can say it however you want. And this is exactly the same experiences, but it leads to facilitation. Remember that facilitation as a term means helping or supporting the process of performance, or again, it could be motivation. So we're saying here that is effectively a positive experience. So of course, why the difference? Well, it comes down to this notion of how the individual perceives these physiological and psychological forces, and I'm going to explore that in a lot more detail, not least in the exam answer we're going to do in a few moments' time. So I want to make that distinction. Secondly, I want us to think about what stress causes. In fact, let me just make sure I'm not doing this in the wrong place. No, I'm not. So I want to think about what does stress, that wasn't the colour I wanted. I wanted some kind of yellow. It's probably going to look ridiculous now. Stress causes, what are the impacts of stress? What actually happens? Well, the first thing I'd like you guys to grab hold of is it leads to a release of hormones. Okay, and specifically we are talking about a part of the brain called the hypothalamus hypothalamus, which I always have to check my spelling for, hypothalamus. And this hypothalamus, it stimulates adrenaline. Okay, now we all know what the feeling of adrenaline is like in the acute sense. You know, if we get that kind of fight or flight, and we get that kind of buzz of, you know, something scaring us, or we go on a ride, or we do something a bit dangerous, or something shocks us, those kind of things. We all know what the acute experience of adrenaline. What you might not realise though is that the chronic experience of adrenaline is that for example, people can't calm their mind. People also experience high blood pressure over a long period of time if they're continuously having this stress response and continually producing this hormone of adrenaline. So let me write that in there. If long term we are talking about an experience of high blood pressure. Now you can use the word hypertension there if you like. So those points I think are really important for us to get a grasp of. I want to say grasp. I'm pretty sure that word doesn't exist. To get a grasp of, let me say it correctly. It's hard doing these things live sometimes. Sometimes your brain kind of betrays you somewhat and does things that you don't want it to do. The other thing that's betraying me right now is my headphone lead, which is getting really in my way. So I may have to take it off in a second. Take them off, I should say. So let's have a look at the notion of a stressor. And stressors, of course, are things that stimulate the stress response. So for me, this is important. Let's take something like a stressor. Let's use it in the most general sense at the moment. And I'm going to look at what these would be in sport for you at the moment. You know, an example would be something like frustration or really hot conditions. These are going to be examples of stressors, okay? But more of them in a second. Now, the point we would like to make to you here is that the stressor is a feature of what we would call some kind of environmental change. Now think about environmental not in the weather context, but as in all of the display, all of the information that's being presented to the performer. So something changes in the environment. So again, let's just take a classic sporting example. A performer realizes, because the score line is whatever it is, the performer realizes that they're going to lose in this performance. They're going to be beaten in their match or their race or whatever, because they're so far behind, or because the difference in the score is big. So of course that would be a stressor, that the environment effectively changes. And the point we want to make is that leads to what we refer to as the stress response. Okay, the stress response. And I'm going to explore some more aspects about this shortly. And we call this the physiological change. The physiological, excuse me. The physiological change. So we've got this notion here of the physiological change in this context. The physiological change. And of course, what that's going to lead to, and we already know the physiological change is kind of this this notion of kind of adrenaline release, but this is going to lead to what we call the stress experience. Now, the stress experience is perceptual. Okay, it is different for different individuals. Okay, it is a perception of the situation. So again, come back to that point of eustress, perception of the situation. Some performers would interpret this stress as positive and it would help their performance. But what we tend to find generally is it's inhibiting, it's negative, it worsens performance. So it depends on how we interpret that. So that perception of the situation is important. Now, a couple of points before we get into specific stressors that I want to make to you. And we are, of course, going to look at our specific model in a few moments' time, because we've kind of touching on already, but we're going to look at that in detail. So a couple of things that I would want to get across to you. So key points. Let me choose a color which is different. Let's go for, can't find what I want. Let's go for this green. So we're saying here, the model is subjective. So these are just summary points. The model is subjective. So this presentation of stress here, this model is subjective. In other words, it's how we interpret it. It's different for different people. We're saying that the model is personal. You and I could have exactly the same experiences, but you may interpret them completely differently to the way I would. And we'd also say the model is perceptual. And this is really where I want to get to a crucial point. And I encourage all of you to switch on deeply at this point. When we talk about this perceptual part, there's two things, or there's kind of a weighting that needs to be weighed up. I'm not explaining this very well. So first of all, we have to perceive. So we take perceptions of the demands of the situation. Okay, so if we are playing in our squash match and we're playing against performer X, depending on what the demands of that situation are going to be an aspect of our perception. In other words, we're going to look at our performer, we're going to look at the scoreline, we're going to think about those kind of things, and we're going to look at how demanding is the situation. How tough a situation am I actually in there? And effectively, what we weigh this up against, so it's this perception versus another perception, and it's this one. It's our perception of the ability to meet the demands. So, of course, if you are in a really challenging environment, you're playing against the best, perhaps you're behind in the scoreline or in the race or whatever, but you believe that you're physically, psychologically, tactically prepared to recover that situation, you're probably not going to find it stressful. If you feel differently to that, if you perceive that you're not fitness, skill, tactically prepared, and the competition's getting away from you, it could lead to stress, or it could just lead to kind of like giving up. In this case, we might be interested in the fact that it could lead to stress. So I think this perceptual battle is very important. Now, how can we deal with that? Well, we want to say here, of course, how can we do that? Well, this becomes about goal setting, right? How do we set process goals? Let's not just judge ourselves on outcome bases, but also this is about being prepared. Be tactically, physically, and psychologically prepared. We're going to talk about some of those preparations in a moment, psychologically at least. So, of course, that is controllable to some degree. Now, I haven't left myself the space I wanted to, but I want to talk about stress in sport. And this is what I want to say. Let me choose kind of a rosy coloured. These are the things that we tend to find cause stresses. Well, there are other examples, but they tend to fall into these categories. So the first one is fatigue. Something like overtraining, or something like the end of a competition, or it could be acute fatigue or chronic fatigue. It tends to cause the stress reaction in people. Okay, so that is a real classic one. One of the others I mentioned just a moment ago is the notion of injury. Injury is partly controllable, but partly uncontrollable. If we experience an overtraining injury, then of course that is controllable. But if we experience an acute injury, an impact injury, for example, it's not entirely controllable, and it can lead to, of course, a lot of loss of work that's been done, and it can lead to stress within performance. Competition itself is deemed to be stressful. Okay, so competing against others is seen to be stressful. Not always, of course, but it can be the source of stress. We can certainly say that conflict is a source of stress. By conflict, we might conflict with an opponent, conflict with a coach, conflict with a spectator, or sort of kind of an emotive audience, to use Jean's terminology. So we've got this notion of conflict, which can lead to this stress reaction. We've also got the notion of frustration. I guess classic examples would be, the official made a bad decision, not in our favour, and now we're losing. Might lead to frustration and stress in that situation. We see that, I think, quite frequently in some sports. And we might also want to be looking at things like the climate. And with the climate, we're talking about things like extreme heat, extreme cold, these types of environments, or something like humidity could lead to like a stress output, because, if a performer's losing a lot of fluid rapidly because they're in hot, humid conditions, that could lead to a kind of a stress response. Okay, so don't underestimate that one. We tend to ignore in sports psychology the notion of the weather as like an environmental condition. We don't incorporate it into like open skills, particularly, for example, or how we interpret open skills. But in this case, sort of extreme temperature changes can, of course, have an impact. Now, where I want to sort of finish off this first section before we look at an answer is the stress response. And I'm not going to do much with this really. I'm just going to present the model to you and just discuss it really. It's something that I would encourage you to learn. If you come back up here, of course, we've got the stress responses here. Okay, it's sort of the middle of our model already. And with stress response, I think it's important to be able to use these terminologies so that we see 3 stages, okay? One is what we call the alarm reaction, okay? Now, you know that this is adrenaline-based, okay? So this is the adrenaline-based kind of flight or, how do you say it, fight or flight? Which way around do we say that? You know what I mean? It's that response. So this adrenaline release, we can call that the alarm reaction, kind of that thing, you know? Resistance is something slightly different. It's getting into a situation of coping with that change of physiology, okay, a change of hormonal balance. So we call that the coping phase. And finally, if that continues over a period of time, we experience what we'd call exhaustion, which ultimately is what we would describe as a low blood sugar level. So of course, it's this thing that's going to lead to things like fatigue, loss in performance, reducing performance, which of course are going to potentially lead to what? More stress response. So it's interesting to see that this is also a cyclical nature as well. We could argue that that leads to that, right? But of course, once we get to a point where we're fatigued and we can't carry on, then we of course have to accept that we've got like an end point there. So I like that model. I think it summarizes, I think, nice key terms for you to include in your answer. But let's make sure that we're able to discuss these causes of stress, definitions, as neatly as possible, please. Now, we have a question. I think I'm going to make the canvas a little bigger here. Just bear with me a second. Wrong way. Let me just make it slightly bigger so we can see it's better. This could make my handwriting look even worse than it normally does. Stress in sport is considered to be a perceptual experience. We agree with that. It is a perceptual experience. It's an individual interpretation of physiological and psychological challenges. Justify. So when we justify, let me go through the question first. Justify this statement in relation to Kate's first Team GB triathlon. So Kate's going through her first Team GB triathlon. It's a new experience. It could be stressful. Depends what she's measuring herself by. But we want to be saying things in this answer such as one reason, another reason. We want to be saying things like I believe, I think. If we're doing things like a justifying skill, we want to be using because. We want to be using this means. Okay, this is kind of the structure of how we justify things. So I'd encourage you to think about that and encourage you to try and get those kind of answers in, those kind of structures into your answer. Some people say to me all the time, well, I'm not going to get a mark for writing because, James, no, you're not. But you're going to be thinking in the justifying frame. So what's going to come out of you in terms of content is justification. So let's get that point clear for all of you out there. I'm not suggesting marks are available for saying one reason is. I'm saying that by linking justifying to a statement such as one reason for this is, you are inevitably, as long as you've got good knowledge, you're inevitably going to justify things in your answer. So those of you that give me grief over that, and it's almost daily, that's that. Right, shut up, James. Let's go on with it. Here's my little bit of ego for the day. Okay, here's my answer. Stress is... So this is interesting, actually. So I've got the term stress in here, and I've got the term perception or perceptual experience in here. I'm going to define those. Stress is negative feelings produced by perceived physiological and psychological forces. Look, there's my mark for defining that term. Perception is the interpretation of the environmental stimuli. I get my mark for actually stating here what those terms mean. Now, I'm probably going to get a sub-max in there. There's going to be 2 marks available for my definitions for saying what these concepts are. Next point. One reason, hey, I'm justifying. Guess what? I've been asked to justify it. I'm doing it. One reason Kate's experience is perceptual is, and actually I don't even like that statement. It sort of feels long. It almost feels like a waste of time. I might just write one reason is. One reason Kate's experience is perceptual is that she may or may not interpret the race as a stressor. Okay, so she may or may not interpret the race as a stressor. This means, there's my language, this means she may not experience the stress response. Okay, so we're saying here, she may experience the stress response, she may interpret the race as a stressor, but she may not. It's personal, it's perceptual. Let's move on. Where am I? Here we go. Another reason, Look, I'm using these terms right. It's making me justify. Another reason is that she may interpret the feelings as positive. This is known as eustress. So I'm only going to give one. I'll do my sunglasses things. I'm going to give myself 1 mark for that. But I'm interpreting, or Kate's interpreting these experiences as positive. It's eustress. Only some people perceive it as negative. I have to admit I'm one of them, unfortunately. But I wonder if it's the same for you. Next point. Long point. I believe, again, I'm justifying. I believe the main reason, I'm almost combining that reason thing, aren't I? I believe the main reason it is perceptual is because, so I'm clearly justifying, look, I'm top of the pops in terms of justifying language, is because it depends on Kate's perception of the demands of the situation versus her perception of the ability to meet those demands. Beautiful. Don't even know how many marks I've got there. But can you see how I've taken my knowledge from here, which I've now got too big on the page. Model is perceptual, perception of the demands, perception of the ability to meet the demands. And now I'm fitting it in to my answer. Therefore, comma, I love that comma. Therefore, comma, if Kate is well prepared, fit and injury free, should be a comma there, she may perceive little stress. So we're basically saying if she is ready, she's not going to be as stressed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I've got my max there, okay? I've got my max there. But we're saying there, look, if she is fit and well prepared, she's going to perform. And I think I've got one other statement here. Finally, if Kate is focused on process rather than outcome goals, she may perceive less stress. So, of course, there would be more marks there, but I've got the 8 marks already. Can you guys see how just from taking this knowledge up here, albeit stretched off the page, I'm now incorporating it into justifying answer? That is what you guys need to do in your exam. Can I stress to you that the best way by a mile to get better at doing that is to use our free roadmap structures. Okay, now I know for a lot of you it's close to your exams and you might not want extra sort of burden and things. That's fine, I understand that. Stick with what you've been told, peeing or ideaing, that kind of stuff, these very limited models. Stick with those if you want. But the roadmap works. You really should have a look at it. So if you've got some time over the coming days and weeks before your exam, you might have weeks by the time you watch this, but if you've got time, have a look at it. Go to theeverlearn.com, have a look at the roadmap. Honestly, it's so helpful for you guys in this situation. I can't endorse it highly enough. And look, guys, I'm not flogging anything. It's free, okay? Get involved. Okay, so let's look at part 2 of this thing here. We're going to look at controlling stress. Now, some of you at least are going to have studied quite a number of these notions in the idea of controlling arousal or controlling anxiety. There is consistency here, so don't be afraid to learn this as kind of really facilitating knowledge for a whole range of areas. Excuse me, sorry. A bit of wind, how embarrassing. So I'm going to get straight into this. The thing I want to draw out first of all, and you guys I reckon already will be familiar with this, is we want to differentiate between the cognitive methodologies of controlling stress and the somatic. Later on, in a few minutes' time, when we look at somatic here, of course, soma means body, of the body. It's physical. Cognitive means of thinking or thought-based. So, of course, this is going to be psychological. So let's address mindfulness first of all. It's actually a really, I really worry about talking about this one because there's a lot of people know a lot about mindfulness, and I'm very much know the basics. So I know, that I'm going to kind of give you what you need to know aspect here, I suppose. So by mindfulness, it's a methodology, or even you can describe it as a value system, which is paying attention to surroundings. So what we mean by that is that it's something whereby the individual remains grounded and remains in a particular moment. It doesn't allow the distracting thoughts, often negative thoughts, to run away from them. Why? Because they're present in the moment and they are noticing what's going on around them. I guess classic examples would be noticing the colours and the textures of things, noticing noticing the details of people's faces, noticing the emotions that people are showing in a particular moment. It helps to keep the individual grounded and not get distracted into sort of deep, heavy thinking. Okay, so it's a nice way to describe that there. So we call it in the present. or would describe it, I should say, as in the present or in the moment. And it is also deeply influenced by the process of meditation, which you will know has become a very common practice for very, very many people in the modern era. Now, I'm not going to go any further with mindfulness. I would encourage you to read it further. Some of you may well be using mindfulness techniques. They're things that I've tried personally in the past where things get difficult, work gets really busy, for example. It's worth looking into. Now, cue utilization is a theory presented by a researcher called Easterbrook. And again, it's a very detailed model, but we're going to just sort of scoot over it here. It works as follows. There's an increase in arousal, which causes a decrease in attentional field. And what we mean by attentional field, of course, is the idea of how many and the breadth of the stimuli which one interprets. So increase in arousal leads to a decreasing or narrowing attentional field. And what that means is that we are capable of missing relevant cues. We start to miss relevant cues. In other words, we might be distracted and not notice what's important to, for example, our performance. And we can call this is the negative view, by the way, we can call this a model of hypervigilance. Now, what does that mean for the performer who wants to avoid stress? Well, it's very simple. Control arousal to the optimal level. So if we control arousal by many of the techniques I'm going to talk about now, we can optimize our arousal level, get the perfect attentional field where we ignore the irrelevant and focus on the relevant, very selective attention sort of model, and we only pick up the relevant cues and miss those which are irrelevant. Now that's what we're trying to achieve, and therefore we get optimal performance. Let's move on. Let's talk about something like goal setting. Goal setting, of course, we're talking here about the notion of there being different types, okay? And you guys will probably already know of the three main types of goals. We've got the notion of outcome goals, okay, which we want to use, but we don't want them to be on their own. We've got the notion of performance goals. These are things like personal bests, personal standards. And we've got the notion of process goals. So the key thing on goal setting is that all three of these types of goals should be used, and the danger comes if we only use outcome goals, something like winning and losing, making a selection, winning a medal, making a final. If we only use outcome goals and we don't use performance and process goals, process goals, by the way, are technique-based goals, then of course we're more likely to experience stress. Outcome goals on their own are not very effective. Outcome goals for the big picture combined with process and performance goals can be very useful, especially for motivation and discipline. But we need to combine those different types of goals. And the other thing we'd say about goal setting is it really should be individualized. If you are in, let's say, a team sport like rugby or football or cricket or netball or whatever, and the goals that you are being set or the goals that you've set yourself are the same as all the rest of the team, you should ask some questions. Individualized goals are what should be taking place. So we also want to talk about the notion of mental rehearsal, and I always think that it's important to say mental rehearsal and imagery. They are a form of mental practice. They are a form of mental practice. They are a form of picturing a skill. Okay, so we want to describe this as picturing a skill, picturing a skill. So it's really important we get that notion across. And of course, because we're picturing a skill, we can of course describe this as a form of imagery. Really important that we can use those words. It's really important as well that we realize with mental rehearsal, we can mentally rehearse, visualize, imagine new or existing skills. New or existing skills, one or the other, or indeed both. Why? It increases confidence. Okay, it increases confidence. It also is useful because we can imagine a feeling, and of course, if we can imagine a feeling of a skill, we can prepare ourselves for the inevitable stress which can often come on. We can become familiarized and knowledgeable about that. So, by imagining a feeling or an emotion, we can kind of insulate ourselves from it. It becomes sort of so normalized that we cannot even turn it into like that eustress. Okay. Now, other points about mental rehearsal. We have got the internal form of mental rehearsal, which of course is you're seeing yourself and your performance from within your body. And we also have external mental rehearsal, or external imagery we often call it. You see yourself from outside, okay? You see yourself from outside. So there's some nice models in there that you can have a think about. Positive self-talk, again, kind of does what it says on the tin, right? It's a fairly obvious one. Positive, it's kind of, you can't even call it positive thinking, really. So two forms of this. One is that we have motivation-based positive self-talk. And this is where we use positive statements to motivate, and we sometimes call it psych up ourselves in our performance. Okay, so that's where we might use the motivation aspect of this. So we've also got the performance-based. And with performance-based, what we're arguing here is that, of course, we're really thinking about being positive about past experiences. Okay, so we're not imagining pictures of what we might do in the future. We're effectively talking to ourselves about those things that have been effective in the past, and it's linguistic, it's verbal. Okay, you're talking it through. When I was in this situation last time, I did the following things and it went really well. That would be an example of positive self-talk. It can also be mantra-based in some contexts. Thought stopping is often thought about the other wing of this. They're often done in combination. My cable's in the way here. So what we're saying here is that we take negative thoughts and we block them. We don't attend to them. We use blocking to prevent them. That's really important. We can also use the language of saying that we refuse attention. We refuse attention on the negative doubt, apprehension, worry. We give it no importance whatsoever by refusing it altogether. And then we've got this notion of rational thinking. It's a very simple notion, but it comes back to what we did in part 1 of this live show. It's based on perception. It's based on perception, okay? Based on perception. And we describe it as logically challenging negative thoughts. Okay, so if, for example, a thought enters the mind before competition, which is I'm not ready, I'm not fit enough, that person's better than me, whatever, rational thinking would be a response like I am ready. I've undergone 6 weeks of really high intensity work. I've stretched properly in my warm-up and cool-down every single session. I've got my tactics prepared. It's logically challenging that negative view. So of course it comes back to the point is you do actually have to do the preparation. So without the preparation you can't logically challenge it because there's no logic. You should be worried if you haven't done the preparation, but if the preparation is there, then it should be possible. Now that's why a lot of athletes will actually say the key to their kind of psychological preparation is to be properly prepared. Now let's have a look at these other notions. I want to talk about centering. Okay, centering is it's a bit like the mindfulness concept. We focus on here and now. Okay, so we focus exactly on what's happening now, and it's an interesting one here. I mean, I wonder if this is kind of psychosomatic in the sense that it spans both somatic, physical, and cognitive, psychological. We concentrate on the center of the body. Okay, concentrate on the center of the body. And it's the idea is to redirect energy. And we're redirecting it where? To the center. Okay, so we're redirected to the center. It's really important that this is done in a quiet place. It's very hard to do this with people around and hustle and bustle. We also, let me put this on here, focus on breathing, more of which in a second. We also focus on breathing. So this centering methodology is a really, really nice one. I'll come back to, I'm going to sort of develop the breathing side over here. Biofeedback is it's not completely separately, but it's about monitoring things. We monitoring things. What do we monitor? Well, we monitor things like heart rate. If we notice heart rate has risen dramatically, that anticipatory rise, then we can do things to address it. What about breathing rate? Can we become knowledgeable of identifying that our breathing rate has suddenly sped up, for example. We can even measure things like skin temperature. This is going to suggest that we've had that stress response. And others are things like muscle tension. Now, the point I would make on this one is you can measure these literally, the heart rate monitor, or you can count breaths, this kind of thing. But it's also just about being sensitive to what your body's doing, noticing these things are happening. That, to me, ultimately is what biofeedback is all about. Sure, someone would say that differently, but for me, that's important. Now, we've got relaxation here. I'm going to talk about PMR in a second, but relaxation, we're going to focus on each muscle group. That's an R. And relax it. Okay, so relaxation is that we're going to literally focus on our calves, for gastrocnemius and soleus muscles, and ensure they are relaxed. Okay, in the preparation. PMR is a similar thing but slightly different. First of all, let's call it progressive muscular relaxation. Muscular relaxation. Really have the impression I'm running out of time here. I'm experiencing a bit of stress myself. It was designed by Jacobson as far back as 1932, so that's where we get this concept from. It's done alone, a little bit like the centering in that sense. How do we do it? We get comfy. Something like armchair, I guess, would be a classic. We get comfy. What do? We think of a muscle. We contract that muscle, and then we relax that muscle. And often people will do this in a particular order, top of the bottom, from top of the body to bottom of the body, for example. You do your shoulders, then down to your chest, then down to your stomach, and so on and so on and so on. So this is going to work really nicely to help people sort of remove muscle tension. Remember, muscle tension is a form of sort of somatic stress. And finally, on breathing control, this is what we'd often describe as the most basic way of somatic control of stress. How do we do it? And come back to this point over here, it's a part of centering too. The idea is deep, slow breaths. Deep, slow breaths. And the main point of this is that we get sufficient oxygen to the parts of our body that need it. Okay, so these methodologies can bring a kind of physiological calmness or quiet to a performer, and that can be really, really effective. All right, so that's that. Let's have a little look at some questions. I may make this a little bit bigger again. Let's do that. Let's make this a little bit bigger, like that. Okay, bear with me a second. All right, let's have a look at this question. Questions, actually. Describe. Describe means that we are going to write the characteristics, the composition of something, what something is like, what something is not like. We don't need to say why or how, we're just saying what it is. Describe 2. I'll only get marked for 2. 2 cognitive methods of reducing stress that Laura could adopt before a big competition. So loads of keywords for there. Describe, I know what it means. Composition, characteristic, what it's like. 2, only 2 are going to be marked. So whichever 2 I talk about first, that's what's being marked. Cognitive, there's no point me talking about breathing control, PMR. These are cognitive methods, thought stopping, positive self-talk, rehearsal, mental rehearsal. These kind of things are what I need to talk about. And only those that are relevant before a competition are going to be credited. So let's see what we would come up with here. So I'm describing negative thought stopping. There's number 1. Only 1 mark for naming it. Is characterized by, I'm going to describe it now, blocking worries and apprehensions and refusing attention to these negative emotions. Now I've got my submax there. 3 marks available for my first of my 2 cognitive methods. So negative thought stopping, it's blocking worries and apprehension, and it's refusing attention to negative emotions. Look, that is literally 1 sentence for 3 marks. Why? Because I know what describe means and I know my content. That's it. I know what describe means and I know my content. Next one. Self-talk, positive self-talk. So there's my mark. Positive self-talk can be motivation or performance-based. Okay, so I'm going to say motivation or performance-based, and is composed of motivating thoughts such as positive past experiences. and there's my max. Okay, so again, literally 2 sentences, 3 marks per sentence. I'm saying the composition, the characteristics. That's what describing means. We do have some false friends when it comes to describing. Sometimes your exam board will say things like, describe how. What they actually mean is explain how. They might say, describe why. What they really mean is explain why. To describe something is to give its characteristics. Get that clear. All right, last question and last part for today. Oh, I've already put part of the answer in. Explain how Laura, so explain how. So here I'm going to be using through, by. These are classic explaining how type words. Explain how Laura could use a range, so we've got to use many, of cognitive methods of reducing stress to ensure that her attentional field is the correct width. Okay, so cognitive methods only. Laura would do this through the process of cue utilization. Okay, so there's my first one, cue utilization. We're finding the optimal arousal level aids concentration there. I'm going to get my submax because I'm going to get 2 marks per methodology, maximum. Okay, next one. Or by, there's my explain how language, look, by, or by performing mental rehearsal. So mental rehearsal through the use of imagery to picture the successful execution of the skill. Okay, so I'm saying how they do this. There's my through again, my explaining how language. Last one. Whoops, sorry. Finally, comma, through, there's my explaining how language, through rational thinking, where Laura could logically challenge negative thoughts. There's my 2. There's my max. Just go back to what we said a moment ago. It's going to be stretched off the page. Look, what did we just say there? I mean, we've got our cognitive, up here. We looked there, thought stopping. Look, I included blocking, refusing attention. I talked about self-talk, motivation-based, performance-based. I mentioned positive past experiences. And I talked about mental rehearsal. And I said there that it's picturing... I did talk about mental... What was my last one? Hang on a second. It was mental rehearsal, wasn't it? Oh, through rational thinking. Sorry. What am I saying? Rational thinking up here. I got my methodologies mixed up. Rational thinking based on perception. So I talked about that. And I talked about this logically challenging negative thoughts. So guys, it really is as simple as that. Know your stuff and know your skill, and you should literally smash this exam. But look, you have to know the skill. Okay, I have to know it happens through by the following. Here is the content. I know what explaining how means. I know the difference between describing, explaining how, and explaining why. I know what evaluate means. I know what justify means. You have to be good at this. Okay, and if you feel undercooked with those things, for God's sake, go and have a look at our roadmap images. It's going to help you a lot.